Hello and welcome, Fright fans, to this, the Horror Story Corner, where today we have a rather special bumper video of ghoulish goings-on. It contains the first 4 horror stories written by myself and released onto the channel. Each story contains the original intro and outro, and you may find them slightly different to usual based on when they were uploaded. Volume 1 includes He Will Swing, a somewhat more traditional ghost tale. At Night It Screams, based around a true tale. He Has a Way, more thrilling and based in reality. And The Chair, a strange story that may somehow be linked with another in this volume. There will be more spine-tingling originals to come in the future, starting with And All Fell Silent, a creature feature that will be uploaded on the 11th of March. But for now, though, sit back, relax, and enter the Horror Story Corner. Hello and welcome, Fright fans, to this, the Horror Story Corner, where today we are celebrating reaching over 500 subscribers. Thank you so much to everyone that has subscribed, listened, liked, or commented so far, and for helping this small community of horror lovers to grow. In response to this, I am today releasing an original horror tale, written by myself, and one of my personal favourites, as whilst I wrote this, late into the night, I managed to give myself a little fright. It's a terrifying traversal into the realms of revenge beyond the grave, born from betrayal and wickedness. It's a story presented by our fear-filled narrator James Adler, and concerns the events surrounding the suicide of his cousin's wife. However, all might not be as it seems, and revelations will place all involved before us, here in the Horror Story Corner. I hope you enjoy. He Will Swing. Account written by James Adler, 12th of August, 1912. The following is a full and frank account of all the information that is relevant and which pertains to the mysterious circumstances surrounding my cousin, Stephen Adler. Although what I write is factual, I must admit here to an expanding and romanticizing of the narrative, as is my habit as a professionally established writer. Although the sources contained herein are a combination of my own memories, discussions with members of Papelwick, and an account written by Stephen, descriptive sections and deductions have been made by me. Having laid out this caution to the reader, I will now commence. Delirium had seized upon Stephen's mind in the cold winter of 1890. His wife had been found dead. She was hanging from the pronounced rafters of an equipped but unused nursery. Her untimely demise had affected Stephen greatly. This was augmented by the note left in her own hand. Although I had personally not read it, he recounted it to me in his somewhat more lucid ramblings. It stated, "It is you, Stephen, that is culpable for this sin. No further options are afforded to me, and it must be so. I pray God is forgiving." Due to the fragile and rambling condition that he found himself in, I felt charged to provide the man lodging. My wife, having raised our 2 fine children and consoled them through fever-driven nightmares, took to the task of nursing him quite well. Distancing himself from Newbury House aided his wailing spirit well, and after 2 days, the bizarre febrile of the mind dissolved. It left in its wake increasing logic and strength. On the 4th day, he arose and managed to make it down to breakfast. Until then, he had taken to either denying food entirely or having to be fed, a task my poor Isabel cared for the least. This morning, however, his moods were enlivened, and all previous shadows around him seemed softened by the breaking light. It was a brittle and tentative state, but one that struck me as deeply encouraging. Upon his appearance at the dining table, I instructed the kitchen to provide a heavy serving, and one complemented by all the items that aid in the strengthening of body and mind. He ate briskly, at first without word, but once his ravenous state began to be quelled by the well-equipped table, he would break occasionally from eating and begin to engage in small discourses. I must add at this point, to any eyes beyond my own, and those of our Lord, that I commit only as close to fact here as memory will allow, and whilst words may change by the dimming effects of time, their meaning shall be as close to the original as I may summon. The conversation I am about to present is at the earliest point of all the events related in this story, and occurred some 22 years prior to it being committed to this page. Further aspects of this recount are closer to our day, and therefore their prose shall be truer. Our conversation went as such. "What is to be done with regards to the funeral? Has she been seen?" Stephen asked, with a developing firmness to his tone that I admit had me taken aback initially. Still, he waited politely, and once I had assessed his readiness for the seriousness of such a discussion, I proceeded, arrested slightly by caution. "The house has been made up as such, but few have visited her. It is a wicked thing to take one's own life, a sin. There can be no hiring of mourners, and any parade we might attempt shall be slight. None will afford us the horses, and I have enquired at length. At least day burials are no longer out of the question. She can be committed to the earth, and may at least find some peace." My words were purposefully restrained and factually accurate, containing as minimal emotion as possible. I did not want to place any further pressure on Stephen's weakened mind. "A sinner, yes, but also my wife," was his reply, and against my better judgment a sudden flash of fury came into me. When next I spoke, I did so with less logical reasoning. "You say such," said I, feeling a rush of blood warming my cheeks. "But through her deeds she has stained your good name. A tarnish on my own, too." "Suicide, Stephen." "What is good in a name? I have lost my wife, sir. That is all. Names are worthless. A good name will not alleviate my grief." At this juncture, there was a palpable sense that Stephen's mind was again descending, so I alighted and carried the subject away to friendly and more airy planes. "It is blissful that we should behold such amounts of light this far into the winter." "There is no light without her," stated Stephen, with a barren and melancholy look, the once bright twinkle that shone from his eyes becoming hazy and dim. "And yet the day still begins, the sun takes its usual place. We continue." This was an attempt on my part to allay his tormenting emotions, but instead he turned upon it with a vile and somewhat surprising anger. "Cavalier, callous and cold!" he shrieked, spitting towards me. "Your kindness is not wanted if it is to be tinged with such disregard. Summon me a trap, I wish to depart." It took some time after this to soothe his rage and convince him that I meant no disrespect or ill will. Eventually, though, resolution was found, and he agreed to stay until her remains had been laid. The prospect of returning to the site of her death was enough to shackle him, and although still flushed with a vermilion anger, he retreated to his room and took to further rest. Stephen and I conversed very little until the funeral. Him, still angry that I had taken the stance I had in condemning his wife's actions, and I, not wanting his anger to evolve into anything akin to madness. On the day before she was to be buried, there was an area of contention with the church. It was instructed that her body was to be laid separately from the graves of others. There was some discussion around the souring of the ground and the unhappiness of the families of those that already rested there. This tragedy was averted by providing the priest with a heavy purse of coins. However, it did stir an amount of condemnation by the general townsfolk, and further darkened their outlook towards us Adlers. The day itself was bare of visitation, but Stephen took to the task of overseeing the burial of his wife like a man, and I felt pride in watching his stern, unfeeling features. After all was done, I offered to accompany him home. He immediately refused this, and requested distance to allow his true torment to surface. "Are you quite certain?" I asked, almost paternally. "You and Isabel have been good enough to me, my dear fellow. I wish to place no further imposition on the two of you. Go home and get some rest yourself. No doubt, whilst caring for me, you too have become tired. You look it, and though you pretend otherwise, the events have taken their toll on you, dear cousin." At this I laughed, improper as it was due to our current location and the circumstances we were in. And Stephen roused a faint smile himself, even if he didn't feel like doing so. "Walking 70 paces to your house is hardly imposition, my good man, and you do not need to trouble yourself with my tiredness or the ill effects events have had on me. Just make sure you are well. Are you sure I cannot walk with you?" "I am certain," said Stephen firmly. "I must begin acquainting myself with the solitude that haunts the widower." Again he smiled, but this time a little less, and with eyes that drifted downward. And looking at him, haunted seemed an apt metaphor. There were new shadows to his face that I had never until that moment observed. "You will join Isabel and I for dinner soon, I should hope?" I asked earnestly. "That I will, cousin," replied Stephen. With that, we parted company at the cemetery gates. I returned home in silent contemplation, but somewhat satisfied that for the most part this macabre affair had been laid to rest. Not 1 hour later, I was stirred from a light afternoon slumber by a monumental pounding at my door. At first, I was a small amount trepidatious in opening it, but I quietened my nerves with reason and summoned my courage. Once opened, an initial relief began to fill me upon seeing my cousin. However, this was short-lived when I saw the ghastly expression wrought upon his features. It was like a man standing condemned before a firing squad. He was worse than on the day he had taken lodging with us, and more of a wraith than a human stood before me. I quickly shielded him from the prying eyes of the village, and acquired not a small amount of brandy. The man was so far afflicted that his trembles were visible, and I feared that he had had another episode of his earlier febrile. I took the fellow by the hand and led him into my study so that we would not be disturbed. I procured a thick blanket from one of the children's old bedrooms and enshrouded him. The weightiness of it seemed to please and quell him in a manner not unlike the slow soothing of an infant. He drew deeply from the glass of brandy, and so quickly that many times he coughed and sputtered. The desired effects began to take hold as he again became more of himself. I waited longer, encouraging him not to speak until he was able to do so. His eyes pierced me as they attached themselves to my form, and his few words, whilst unassuming at first, became disturbingly unsettling the longer they were left to linger. The most dreadful of all was the line he repeated most frequently, and this I can record word for word as though it were etched permanently into my mind. In almost a hypnotized stupor, he repeated, "She has stayed with the house." Few other perceivable utterances were given, or, I should say, I failed to retrieve any further fixed meaning from the man, so I opted instead to aid him to retire. With some effort, I managed to escort Stephen to the attic room, and provided him with enough heavy eiderdown so that he was both comforted and warm. He slipped into a slumber easier than I imagined, and I lingered by his bedside, repeating the phrase he had stated. This one fully formed idea. She had stayed with the house. And what he had meant by it plagued me late into the evening, so that, even upon the arrival of my dear wife, I found it impossible to leave my study, and betray my solitude and fixation. She did call on me, to check that I was well, but receiving only a scowl and silence, she began to exit. It was not my usual habit to refrain from greeting and showing kindly affection, and the abstinence would no doubt leave her somewhat startled. Hence, before she could fully remove herself from the study, I took her softly by the shoulders. I allayed her dismay by stating that it was due to Stephen that I had become so ponderous, and, sated by this alone, she too retired to bed, not requiring or asking any further explanation. For my mind to seek relief and to cease playing those words over, I found no further option than to investigate the macabre state of affairs for myself. Before doing so, I looked in on Stephen, but finding a restful sleeper, and even a semblance of serenity in his brandy-sedated state, I left him to his dreams undisturbed. Not wishing to wait for the morrow, I took a heavy coat, scarf, and sturdy boots, and bore out into an unwelcoming night, filmed by thick fog that hid the sky and made the few traces of moonlight beautiful, but redundant in aiding my sight. Mercifully, the distance was short, and having walked these cobbled and uneven streets for the better part of 4 decades, I arrived at Newbury House without incident. The sensation of the place had altered, and the air, already deeply chilled by the full throes of winter, cut deeply. The frame of the manor stood forth from the mist, and was oddly illuminated against the darkness by some hidden and almost preternatural source. Indeed, even on such a starless and deep night as this, every stone and crevice of the facade was visible. It had taken to its features something of a haunted quality, one never noticed by any passer-by before this evening, but now unmissable and undeniably there. It was an offness, slightly away from centre and correct, and dreadfully unsettling. I wanted to make haste and to scout the place, so that I may return home to a warm fire and strong drink, but found my conviction waning. There was no approaching a thing so suddenly ghastly, not if one wished to retain a semblance of sanity. Instead, I kept my heels close to the edge of the pavement, and sought refuge in keeping a distance between myself and the building. However, no matter the distance, I could still hear Stephen's words, and alone, in the dark and the mist, they seemed even more ghoulish. She has stayed with the house. I took a moment to compose my emotions, to steady my nerves, and to remind myself, despite my failing fortitude, that this was reality, and not the fever dream of some horror-obsessed narrator. After quelling myself for some time further, I turned my attention back to the manor. At first I sought shapes in the surrounding land. It was vacant and enveloped in the thickening mist. Next I proceeded to run my eye over the many casements. They were empty and mainly curtained. I had taken my time to inspect all but one, and it was in this space, between looking from the penultimate window to raising my attention to the one belonging to the nursery, that my soul was seized by a grave foreknowing. There was an attempt by my own body, I believe, to divert my sight and shield me from what I was about to witness. But inquisitiveness overruled preservation, and my eyes continued on their preordained path. Prior to the moment I am about to relate, I had heard of the peculiar expression of one's blood running cold, but until I saw that figure, I had had no true experience of it. It began as a firm disbelief, but morphed into a thrusting chill that forced all of the air out from my lungs. Then came the odd sensation of wanting to cry, as though within one single vision all illusion of safety and rationality had drained away to reveal a world more bitter, more wicked. Because there, in the unlit room, the one designed to welcome new life, she swung by her neck, hanging from the rafters. One of her hands, so awfully bone-like, clawed at the noose around her rope-burnt neck. The other reached out toward my very soul and implored me to set her free. There was terror, yes, and it was deeper than any I had ever known before. But there was also an unspeakable sense of tragedy. I feared, yet I mourned this poor beast. The pure whites of her eyes showed no hatred, only suffering. But this could not dispel the shock of her presence alone. The fact that she had indeed remained with the house was enough to render me incapacitated and in a petrified stupor. As a momentary aside, I assume you, as reader, question my vision on a night of such overwhelming blackness. You too might question how well I could see the nursery window from my position at the roadside, several meters back from the building. I must admit here that I too have wondered how I saw so clearly on that so foggy of winter evenings. But weather and darkness were irrelevant. Space and perhaps even time were strangely transmuted in that moment, and though the figure hung in the window, the space between myself and the glass exited, so that I found myself placed beside her. Every detail swayed in a horrific fashion before me, her lips bluing as the temples throbbed to push fresh oxygen to her dimming mind, ultimately failing. She had regretted her actions, that was apparent. Her face was not of a woman that wished to taste death any further. I was surprised by how determined she was to claw at the rope, until her fingernails splintered and tore out. It made it impossible to believe that she wished to taste death at all. Everything in her wanted to live. Then, without knowing exactly what, I perceived that there was something else. A dark mass gathered by the door of the room, and from this shape I could sense a pure hatred. I think it was watching her. I think it wanted her to die. Without conscious thought, the words "I am sorry" exited my lips, and with them I was released from this vision, space returning and throwing me off balance. Tumbling hard onto the concrete, I hit my head into unconsciousness. After some time, I know not how long, I awoke and stumbled away, part crawling. Though dazed, I took great care not to look at the manor window again. Bafflingly, by the time I arrived home, Stephen had awoken, gathered his few belongings, and had taken his leave. I learnt this from a frantic Isabel as she tended dutifully at the gash that still scars me today. Apparently, he had left in a mixture of fear and fury, and stated that he needed to be as far away from this town as possible. After what I had seen for myself at Newbury, I could quite understand him wanting to place some distance between himself and the manor. I did not blame him nor judge him for fleeing. I was, however, greatly concerned for his welfare, and whilst I would not restrict or hamper his flight, I did send word of his leaving to family and mutual friends. I asked that should he make contact with any of them, that they should inform me immediately. I did not hear anything of Stephen again for a very long time. And as the days gathered into months, I began to fear the worst. Finally, as the months formed years, I gave up hope of ever speaking with him again, although the optimist in me placed him amongst the living still. The years that gathered between then and now are of little relevancy, and pertain only to the personal matters of my own life. My experiences bear no further insights to the narrative as a whole, as, since the night that I saw the horrible and pitiful spectre at the nursery window, I have had no further dealings with the world that seeps from the shadows of our own. At least, not until very recent developments which I will relate to you shortly. Before I do, it may be of small relevance to note that in the first few years after Stephen departed, Newbury fell into the hands of the bank and was let to a succession of different but reputable persons, some of whom I had the pleasure of entering into discourse with. By all accounts, reputable though they were, few tenants remained in the house much longer than several weeks. It was said that many were plagued by visions and clamours rising from the depths of the occult, and whilst I never heard word of any physical harm that befell those individuals brave enough to reside within Newbury, I did hear of one poor soul who, convinced they were visited by a spectre driven mad by a murderous desire for revenge, attempted to hang themselves in the very same room that Sarah, Stephen's wife, had died. Upon hearing this story, it did make me wonder if the dark and angry mass that I sensed, watching from the corner of the nursery, observing Sarah's suicide, may have been the same creature that pressed this fellow to want to kill himself. It also made me question if there was some supernatural interference in my cousin's wife's sad departing, and the thought of it chilled me. The gentleman who attempted to kill himself was apparently seen by a physician who recommended admittance to Millbrook Asylum. After this, and a string of other peculiar circumstances, the house was propositioned for sale at a figure absurdly below its worth. Yet no one bought, and as further time mounted, the house groaned under years of disuse, and began to wither and decay. As previously stated, during all of this I had heard nothing from Stephen at all, and then, quite without warning, I received a letter that he was to travel from London and arrive back in Papelwick. This letter I received but a few weeks prior to this very day. To state that I was jarred by finding him to be both alive and well would be quite an understatement. However, knowing that he would soon return home filled me with joy and an inexplicable trepidation. I couldn't completely explain the latter, but I assumed it related in some way to what I had seen immediately prior to Stephen's departure all those years ago. Herein I have enclosed a copy of his letter for perusal by the reader. Dearest cousin, with such a noble and caring heart as the one that nursed me back from the very edge of the abyss, I know that you will forgive me for never writing before. I thank you too for not making chase beyond the word you sent out to our friends and neighbours. It was a simple necessity to put our shared town and the memories within as far from my mind as possible. And, truthfully, it may have remained that way until I myself fertilized the oxeye. Circumstances have now changed. As you know, I had a penchant for the game of whist, and of throwing my wealth towards the pockets of other men. As such, I find myself with little remaining. Hence, I am counting upon your generosity of spirit once again. If it is suitable, I wish to stay with you and your darling wife, Isabel, who I trust is quite well. I would not consider such imposition if I were not desperate, my dear friend, but it is in desperation that I beseech you. You will find enclosed a return address. If my request is too great, then please do state so. I assure you, you will not find me sore, only understanding. Although it is a terrible thing to me that I must again revisit a place haunted with the death of my darling one, who you know I adored with all that I am. It can only be good that I am again able to be acquainted with my own blood. I hope that you will feel a surge of happiness in receiving my presence, but for now I am, as always, your affectionate cousin, Stephen Adler. From this point we communicated by letter, and for convenience by telegram. I offered Stephen lodging for as long as he should desire it, and he expressed a high amount of gratitude. The last correspondence stated that he was to arrive by hired carriage. He would have taken the train, but due to the coal strike making conveyance by that method a momentary improbability, the former was preferred. It should have taken 2 days. After 5, I had heard no more, and decided that somewhere on his route his mind had altered. I sent telegrams, but none were answered. 2 days following my last unanswered telegram, and taking us to slightly over 4 weeks from the day that I now write, there was an unexpected knock at my door. I readily attributed it to a delayed Stephen, but upon opening it, I was surprised to see David Pask, the local baker. He was deathly pale, and of a pallor that suggested he was near to fainting. I took him into my study promptly, and, once I had rested him in my high-backed chair, closed the door too. When I observed the first colours of life blush into his cheeks, I made comment. Again here, I shall present the dialogue as best as my recollection will allow me. However, it is done so without the collaboration of those involved, and whilst the general idea will remain, the content may not be exact. I believe I began by stating, "Mr. Pask, are you quite well, or are you in need of a doctor?" The man looked so affrighted, I feared that he may never speak again, but after a moment's pause and several crossings of himself, he spoke. "I have seen the most ghastly of apparitions. O Lord, protect us." He crossed himself further. "Where, and of what?" Although I knew the answer before it left his tongue. "Newbury," he whispered, and his face contorted at the utterance. I felt the same curiosity of cold blood seize me as it did on the night that I saw Sarah. I had passed Newbury on many occasions since the event, and not one of those times did I dare fashion my gaze so that it may meet the inside of the nursery window. After a time, passing by with bowed head had become my wont, erasing any chance of placing my vision anywhere near that casement. Suddenly a surging life broke out of the baker, and he clutched undignified from his knees at my sleeves. You must come with me. Come with me to Newbury this instant. There is a darkness about the place which you must see," the baker preached, almost as a vicar in sermon. "Was it her?" I inquired, wishing not to have my question answered. "Her? No." At this, David seemed taken aback and slightly puzzled. "It is him. Your cousin, James. It is Stephen." With this revelation, my own fear dispersed slightly, so that I became more acquainted with the need for action. "Is Stephen hurt?" I inquired, but did not provide enough room for an answer. "I will go with you, David, although that building is one that I have wished many times were rendered to fragments. It is a place that I knew some day I would have to return to. Is Stephen waiting there? Is there some mischief afoot?" "He is dead," the baker placed quietly and simply. "Dead?" I pressed, with an abruptly frantic tone. "He swings from the same rafter as his departed wife." I felt my own colour slip. For years, nothing. Perhaps even with my optimism, imagining that he had already met his own end, and then hope of reconciliation before news far ghastlier than mere death. 2 suicides and 1 attempted suicide, all in the same manner, all in the same room. It was too much for a gentleman, and I admit here that I descended somewhere below full comprehension of the events taking place. It was my Isabel, who had in later years adopted a particularly strong and calm manner, that managed to rouse and level me. "Darling, darling, it is so terrible and so shocking, but your strength is needed now more than ever," she entreated. These words echoed around until they gained a semblance of meaning, and then that meaning bore acid within me until I found myself stood and almost fully together. I am sorry. Perhaps the constable was the correct course of action," the baker said, still white, and with shame lowering his brows. No, you were right to alert me, but the constable should be informed," I stated. "This needs to be properly investigated. I shall accompany you." I was earnest in this resolve. "You will most certainly not. The shock of such could kill you," Isabel countered. "Alas, perhaps you are right. I feel my age. It is weighing heavily at this moment." David needed to hear no more, and though still in shock himself, he set about quickly in reassuring me that matters would be taken care of. I sat, redundant, and allowed Isabel to provide me comfort. In the following days, the funeral was completed for much less coin and with much less condemnation than that of Stephen's wife. The vicar had been sympathetic in his temperament, and there had been softening views of suicide generally, as we moved from our hard Edwardian to our new Georgian sensibilities. The matter was then closed in my own mind, and to protect my nerves I did not turn to speculation regarding some preternatural and malevolent spirit. As I saw it, or as I wished to see it, Stephen, having been on the point of financial ruin, and seeing the house in which his wife had taken her own life, became so overwhelmed with grief that he clambered through the wreckage. Once firmly in the spot of her death, he took to doing the same. A terrible but completed tale. Then, 1 week before this very day, the constable came to my door. As Stephen's only living relative, he saw it fit that I should possess his last words, written in a shaky hand on several small pieces of paper found in Newbury. But before he took his leave, the constable warned me that their content was rambling and nefarious. He suggested that there was very little use in the reading of them, other than to see that Stephen's mind was clearly unwell, and recommended that I shouldn't, but ultimately he left that decision to me. It is regretful to state, but having studied them closely, and in a rash effort to save my own stability, I committed them to flame. However, reflecting on the situation and deciding that it is worse to keep the whole burden of knowledge to myself, for the words remain fresh in my mind no matter how I try to erase them, or to bury them in some dark recess, I have instead decided to keep record of all these terrible events. Hence, I will add what I have learned from the papers here, and what I have since learned from other villagers. Then I will leave it to the reader to decide for themselves the meaning and authenticity of the whole affair. And I hope, in the act of doing so, I can create some small space in my own mind to again let in some light and peace, which may someday lead to a restful night's sleep. Again, and for the final time, I must state that, as this is a telling in my own words, I can but only apologize as to my dramatic and descriptive nature as an author, committing the words as if they were fanciful fiction affords me more bravery to continue, and continue I must. Stephen arrived back in Papplewick 2 days after I had received his last telegram, and urged his conveyance to slow, allowing him to alight at the edge of town. Too much inactivity caused his limbs to take on a dim ache, and he required some good country air. Along his excursion he took to the homeliness of a quaint eatery, and indulged in a plate of rather splendid meats and cheeses, and accompanied it with beer. He found, to his liking, that the charges were much less than that of the city, and in spite of his financial issues, his pocket remained undented. A little tighter around the waist, he continued along to the heart of the town, but somehow, and quite without his knowing, he happened upon the cast-iron gates of Newbury. A curious flutter of an imagining was born in that moment, as he stood looking at the magnificently high gables. The stonework remained immaculate, if not a slightly darker shade than he had recollected. In the many years it had not lost everything of the initial charm that had drawn him towards it. Perhaps it was that immodest, luring charm that led him into wanting to enter again. He felt no ill towards the structure, and did not find the building intimidating. In fact, it was rather welcoming, excluding the surrounding gardens, which had been overcome by weeds and unruly wildflowers. Carefully, his eyes moved towards the window of the nursery, and there, in the window, stood only vacancy. The imagining grew in force until it was almost said out loud. If chance would allow, he could live there again. Surely, after all the years of disuse and with the support of his wealthy cousin, he could acquire it once more. Perhaps, in time, make a healthy profit, which could furnish his love of gambling for many more years. Feeling strong and almost overcome with an odd excitement, the old fear of the place had vanished entirely. After all, what could there be to fear in the dazzlingly bright beams of summer which surrounded him? He pushed open one half of the gates, and it cried out in the agony of 20 years of dormancy. Suddenly his heart took on a quickening rhythm, which somewhat cleared his dreaming mind. He paused, considering if his current actions were the correct course, and he almost turned away. But the smiling sash windows and the pleasant air of the place took him. There was an inviting scent carried on the delicate breeze, and, though he believed it was mainly thought rather than material, there seemed to be quelling song entering his mind and drawing him forwards. He moved through the gate and up to the grand door. It was ajar. And in that short moment there was a final swelling caution that tried to pull him back. It tried to send him towards Isabel and myself. It tried to send him to safety. But it was ignored. Inside, it was a thoroughly different state of affairs. The open door had allowed months of weather to distress the house, leaving only a remarkable shell with ramshackle and sodden innards. It was hard to see through the dimness. Thick dirt had buried itself along the insides of the windows and permitted no telling as to the time of day. It became dimmer still as Stephen heard the tall, heavy door thud to a close. He turned to it and banged himself against it, fumbling at the handle to no avail. It remained tightly closed. Defeated, he turned back to face the hallway. There was no sense of charm in the place at all any longer, and instead it was replaced by a foreign, searing unease. Then, and with an almost complete certainty, Stephen felt that something there meant to cause him harm, and he turned about again to face the door. Strangely, and although Stephen was able to move about the rest of the house as freely as any man, as he approached the door, he felt the air thicken to an almost sludge-like consistency, so that when he was in reach of the handle, he could move no further towards it. Moving away, the imperceptible force relented, and thinking it just a fancy of the mind, he attempted to make the door again. The peculiar sensation ceased for a second time, and a third, before Stephen could make no mistake. Something was restricting his escape. He was trapped within the manor. Abandoning all hope of exiting through the main threshold, he turned, and with a quickening pace began to detect his immediate surroundings. Half memory led him through the darkened hallway and to a door in the far left corner. Opening it, he entered his old study. As the main gas lines hadn't reached Papplewick on his departure, and as Stephen figured in all likelihood still hadn't, the custom was to burn oil. However, the oil had been used up many years before his return, and so he began searching through an old desk. Inside a small drawer in the lower right-hand side, his hand landed upon 2 small candles, and a lighter. Look appeared on his side as a weak flame bore forth when he struck it, and lasted only long enough to take to the candle before extinguishing. As the flame rose, and began a slight illumination of the room, he felt himself breathe deeply for the first time since he had entered. He used the candle to move over to the Leyden window. His first action was to challenge the integrity of the casement, but alas, after several attempts it was clear that it would give nothing to his force. So instead, using his sleeve, he tried at length to remove the thick gatherings of dust and grime that had amassed over the passage of time. This endeavour also proved fruitless, removing only superficial specks and allowing no further light to quell his growing disquiet. Frustrated, he turned to leave the study, and moved back into the hallway, gaining a sight of the front door. He charged towards it, favouring speed over caution, but he was met this time with an equally abrupt force, which threw him back and knocked him from his feet. After a few moments, he rose again, and manoeuvred his view back to that of the entrance hall, and here he considered varying recourses. To his immediate left was an entrance to the dining hall, which led on to the kitchen and then through to the servants' quarters, all of which were now quite empty. Before him was the door that led to his study, and a flight of stairs containing 15 steps in total. To his right was the long corridor, which had at one time been pleasant for musing in the summer, due to the fine art he had hung, and the 3 large windows that ran across it. It was here that his eyes were fixed when he first made out her form. It began with nothing more than a flicker, but in the preceding moments a mass quickly began to develop. The shape was adorned in a white flowing garment that around the legs and wrists of the wearer seemed adjoined to her thin, blue-tinged flesh. It cast from its essence enough fluorescence so that the thing alone might have been seen, but around it the darkness gave the impression of growing ever darker. Fractured and yellowed nails hung loosely from the hands and feet of the spectre. It was undeniably her, even in her bulging, strangled death complexion. It was the tormented spirit of his very own wife, though the apparition was far more sinister and abhorrent than any moment in her life, or of any visiting nightmare Stephen had experienced since her death. The mouth, affixed in too toothy a grin, stretched to sickening proportions, so that the corners rested almost at the eyes, which themselves were bulging white, with no irises or pupils to speak of, and traced along their surface were throbbing red veins, fit to burst and spray cascades of congealing blood at any second. Every bone must have been broken in that horrible neck, for the sound it made, a tearing, clattering, scratching, was indescribably dreadful, and the head swung and hung limply by her shoulder. There was something she clung to, something which swayed within her grip, and with a sudden surging horror, Stephen saw what the spirit held out towards him. It was offering a rope with a noose tied at the end. "No!" Stephen wailed, his eyes bulging almost as much as hers. "I will not! You will not do that to me!" And he spat towards her defiantly. Then the spectre began to flicker again, this time vanishing and recurring, as if in and out of existence. Each time it again became visible, it returned closer with more menacing a gleam. It continued to do so until it was mere inches away from Stephen, and cast out the rope so it might wrap around his neck. Stephen dodged the noose and turned, with a heart close to beating its last, and he moved in long, fast strides towards the dining hall, but as he reached the entrance to the room, the banshee rose before him again. He then attempted his study, but once more her figure returned to deny him access. He found quite quickly that he was surrounded by her form on every side but one, the staircase, and he became acutely aware that she was restricting his movements and leading him down a path of her designing. Dashing feverishly to the top, he found her again, stopping him from moving down the left side of the corridor. The flickering grew in speed, and at points she was almost entirely upon him, rope swinging for his neck, broken fingernails clawing for his jugular. Facing her and moving backwards, he quickened his pace to try and increase the distance between them. From behind, he could hear a heavy, swinging weight and a creaking from the rafters. She was driving him towards the nursery. She meant for him to suffer the way that she had suffered. She meant to do to him what had been done to her. Anger grew from beneath Stephen's fear. He would not bend so willingly to her deathly desires. He was the man, and hell, beast, or otherwise, he would not yield to her. Directly prior to the moment she was to lurch forth, providing him no recourse but to collapse through the entrance to the damned room where he was to die, he motioned swiftly to the right, and instead launched himself into one of the guest bedrooms. With haste, he took a sturdy chair and placed it at the handle of the door, hoping, no matter how futile, that this gesture may somehow restrict her entry. In his shock, he had let the candle fall somewhere along the landing, but he had retained both the silver lighter and the second shorter candle in his breast pocket. After striking the lighter several times, it finally produced just enough of a flame to light the wick. It was in here, and by that small, dying light, that he managed to gather some papers and writing equipment from an old writing bureau, and on those papers he documented what I have here elaborated. There were 3 more entries in his hand, beyond which I have already related, and here I may record them precisely. The first said, "My confession." However, no confession was ever given chance to manifest. The second, and in slightly rougher, more jagged lines, but still notably his, were the words, "My candle is extinguished." The final entry read, "She is in the room." Stephen wrote no more, but there is something besides, something that causes my mind the most trouble, and allows credence to his dreadful words. Amongst the small bundle of papers, there was one more sheet, a short piece, but not of Stephen's hand. The writing was quite different, and there seemed to be some rage contained within the strokes. In presenting this last element of the terrible affair to the reader, I hence put my mind to it no more, and upon submitting this story for publication, leave it for those more capable of delving into the realms that turn mortal men into quivering wrecks. It read, "I only wished to be unbound from a hostile and untrue wedlock. He only wishes to leave this house, but he will swing. He will swing. He will swing as I swung." Well, well, well. It seems there was more to poor Sarah's demise than meets the bulging eyes. And what of Stephen? Well, I'm sure he's still somewhere in Newbury. Maybe he's just hanging around. Regardless, it seems that he has received his just deserts, and is now forever a member of the darkest regions of the Horror Story Corner. Let's just hope that it's enough to let Sarah finally rest, lest she remains, waiting until the day that she may take out her murderous revenge on any man who has wronged a woman and is dreamily drawn through the cast iron gates of Newbury House. Until next time, fear fanatics, and as always, sleep well. Hello and welcome, Fright fans, to the Horror Story Corner. And today we are celebrating because the channel has reached its first milestone of 100 subscribers. As such, and as part of the celebrations, I am releasing an audio of one of my own original tales. Now, a quick disclaimer. One of the characters in this story is Irish. However, My inability to conjure anything close to an authentic Irish accent means that I will be reading the part using my own accent. Also, there will be some adult language in this story, though this is infrequent. A final note is that the story is loosely based on true events, told to me by a close friend from Galway about an experience his grandfather had. And if you enjoy this tale, please let me know in the comments below, as I'm willing to re-record it with my good friend as a guest, reading the part that is based loosely around his grandfather. The story is set in County Wexford and centres around a man named Seamus, who believes he's on a late night but rather routine journey out to look at an electrical fault on a small nearby island. Little does he know that on that island something awaits him. Something macabre, but not completely unfamiliar. And there's a sound too, one that he has heard before. After all, at night, it screams. I hope you enjoy. It wasn't long into the journey, the third or fourth evening, when we found ourselves, Jack, Connor and I, just outside of Wexford town in County Wexford, having travelled down from Dublin the previous day, with Cork, Limerick and Galway still on our list of destinations, and with the latter costing a considerable amount for the three of us. This was in no small part because we had to secure 2 rooms each evening, due to one of the party refusing to share. We had decided to stay out of the larger towns that fell in between our core destinations. Instead, we found cheaper places to stay in the countryside. After securing rooms at a small bed and breakfast for more than we thought was reasonable, we inquired as to the nearest place to get a drink, and was directed to the Dewdrop Inn. It was here, in this quiet, unassuming place, that I was told a ghost story. It was a story that was quite simple in its content, but one that has no less stuck with me over the many years. And though it is true that I didn't know the gentleman who relayed the events, nor did I meet him again after their telling, there was something in his fear and conviction that made me believe him, and moreover filled me with a kind of dread I hope to never experience again. The walk from the bed and breakfast to the pub was uneventful but beautiful. It took us past endlessly rich emerald fields and quaint coves. There was a small church nearby our destination that was mostly unremarkable. However, due to the surviving frame being quite barren, and the single turreted tower seeming so lonely, standing amongst its sparse gravestones, it conjured up the image of a church's skeleton. It was almost as though through its bareness it was revealing hidden structures, not meant to be seen by the naked eye. This was an odd way to reflect upon it, and is perhaps the only reason that I remember it. All of us were in good spirits. The youngest, who was born and raised in Ireland, was perhaps the most jovial of all, and had us laughing at stories from his home in Galway. It was amazing to me, being as I was from a large city in England, that so many of the homeless people in Galway were known by affectionate nicknames, such as Susie the Gob, a title that served the dual purpose of describing both her loud wails and the fact that she resembled a dishevelled goblin, or John the Goat, who would pass his time crying out in loud, wordless ramblings at passers-by, and then casually returning to eating his newspaper. The stories kept us engrossed, and when we arrived at the pub, we almost walked straight past it. The issue was that the building looked very similar to the houses in the area, with their whitewashed stone walls and low, dark-slated roofs. The only item that distinguished it was a small plaque that read "The Dewdrop Inn," which luckily Connor had spotted. Once inside, I was pleased with how light and pleasantly modern the place was, although many of the surfaces and chairs were wooden and varnished dark, which drained some of the cheer out of the otherwise brightly decorated room. The three of us pulled our stools up to the bar and continued our discussions around Connor's hometown over drinks. After the first round, a fierce, shrieking storm started up from nowhere, engulfing the small watering hole. it made us stave off returning to the B&B early and instead settle in for several more drinks. After Jack had bought his second round, and we had moved on to the topic of the itinerary for the next few days, the front door of the bar flung open, almost tearing from its hinges, and a dark shape hurtled through, falling to the floor. My immediate response was to help, and I picked the weary-looking traveller up, placing him on a stool a little distance from my companions and I. The old man was visibly trembling and feebly attempting to draw steady breaths. He was drenched from the storm and was making strange, low, muttering sounds that were impossible to decipher. I thought he may be drunk, but there was no discernible odour of alcohol about him. After considering an attempt to strike up conversation, I instead decided to move back over to my seat and settled on observing him. Every now and then he would pause in his mumbles, take a sudden, alarmed look behind himself towards the door, and place his hands tightly over his ears. Then he would lower his hands and return to mumbling. This continued for several cycles before he started to calm, and slowly he began to form actual speech. Finally, I turned towards him and asked loud but kindly if he was all right. He paused completely then and looked up at me. His eyes were a stormy blue, and there was an emotion to them that I had never seen before, a kind of pitiful sadness, and then something altogether worse but harder to place. He looked over his shoulder again, with his hands hovering close to his ears, and then turned back towards me. "A drink, son," he uttered, in a hoarse and fractured voice. "Whiskey'll do it." There are many strong accents in Ireland that, through the fear and madness this man displayed, would have been rendered unintelligible to my understanding. However, his was softer, akin to the region of Galway, and therefore easier for me, an Englishman, to comprehend. I ordered him a Jameson without any further inquisition and allowed him to drink it silently and in peace. He ordered another after draining the glass, and I noticed that whilst his shudder began to quell and his raspy breathing began to ease, he continued to look behind himself, and each time he did, he brought his hands towards his ears. Eventually, this too became infrequent, and then the man stared blankly forward, soundless and with unblinking, tearing eyes. "Are you okay?" I repeated later, leaving my companions and moving to stand beside him. The man didn't flinch. He didn't remove his gaze from the nothingness that he stared towards. "James is my name. From England. Birmingham. How about you?" "Fethard," he stated, dazed. He took another sip of his drink. "Just across the way there." And to punctuate his speech, he cocked his head to the right-hand side and gave a little nod. "If you don't mind me asking," I approached steadily and with caution, "what happened earlier? You seemed shaken." The old man's gaze switched over to meet mine, and the swirling blue of his frosty eyes bit at my question. "And if I told you, what then?" he spat, just short of anger. "It's too late for me, and no one would believe me anyway. I see no point in it. I'm dead." He took a deep drink from his glass and walked towards the men's. I rejoined my friends, who had been watching and couldn't resist commenting, in a less than flattering manner, about the situation. An hour passed, and with some help from the plentiful libations, I had almost quite forgotten about the small old man with the misty eyes and the wild but fitting mop of white hair. That was until I felt a small tap on my shoulder, which was soft, as if done by some shy child. I turned to see the same old man, wearing an expression far less intense, and even slightly apologetic looking. He didn't quite raise his eyes to meet mine. "Seamus, that's my name. I thought I'd make your acquaintance. I want to tell you what happened. If you still be willing to listen, of course. I feel like someone should know, even if they think me foolish. It might be the last tale I get to tell, you see. As strange as the man's words were, what was stranger was the absolute conviction in his tone and mannerisms. It made it hard to resist the man, regardless of what his tale might be. Jack and Connor turned away from us, quietly but obviously laughing at the eccentricities of the old man, and occasionally looking towards me as though asking if I was really going to listen to him. "I was there, you see," the old man began without waiting for my approval. "Over in Fetard. Over in a small flat. Well, small to you, sir, maybe, but to me palatial. Not palatial, actually. That would be too far a stretch of the imagination for any man. Let's just say enough then. All that I need, you know? Been a few rough years. Drink and drugs had their way with me. I got off 'em, though, a good few years back, and hadn't been at 'em long enough for it to cause any lasting damage." I took a sideways glance towards his whiskey, and he noticed. "Oh, aye, this. Well, I ain't no saint, and I ain't gave it up completely, mind. What I mean to say is I'm steadier on it. Take it in moderation, you know. And no more drugs, at all. Off them altogether." I eyed the man, and it was true that there seemed to be little visible damage wrought upon him by drug misuse. Physically, he retained a good complexion, all of his teeth, and was by all accounts a generally handsome figure. If I had to hazard a guess, I would have placed him at around 60, but a solid-looking 60-year-old. He almost looked like Oliver Reed in his later years, although a lot less portly. So, as I say, the place is everything to me after some troubled years, and I have a good job again doing what I love. "Sláinte!" a crowd cheered in the background, which caused the man to topple from his seat, grasp at his ears, and to shrivel down to his knees. I met him low and told him it was just a toast, offering a sympathetic tone. Somewhat embarrassed, he stood, and I walked him back over to his stool at the bar. After looking around for himself, he continued. "Sorry about that, son," he said. "Anyway, as I was saying, I'm an electrician, you know. Always been good with me hands, there, and been trained for many years. Well, there was no call for me a few years back, but it looks like the workforce has dwindled, so I was able to get me sent a nice job in me place, the one over in Fetard." I nodded to show I was still listening, not wanting him to be interrupted or to lose his train of thought, and slowly tugged at a nearby stool, sensing the story may take more than a few minutes. So I'm sitting down to some food, nothing fancy, just a bit of fresh chowder and a hunk of soda bread, a little of the black stuff to help it all digest, you know. Again, not chasing the bottom of a glass like in the old days, but pacing and doing it for leisure. I could tell he wanted to reassure me of this, and of the fact that alcohol played no part in this tale. Well, as I'm eating, the bloody phone lights up, and no one calls these days, do they? So it could only be work, otherwise people would just message you, wouldn't they? If it's a call, it's either work, bad news, or some bloody bugger trying to sell you that god-awful PPI thing. So I look before I answer, and it's the boss. He tells me there's been a blackout over on the islands. Well, you worry, don't you, when you hear of a blackout on the islands? You think, if something happens to that underwater cable, well, that's business affected, tourism affected, everything affected. Turns out it's only the smallest island, though. Only one property affected. Only one property on it. Anyway, he says to me that he knows it's late and he knows it's getting dark already, and he's sorry, but the man who lives alone on that tiny island, Davy, is very old and wouldn't do well without the electric. So he asked me to see if it's a quick fix. Fuses, you know, maybe some damage to the wiring. Obvious stuff. Doesn't want me making any further investigations than that. But he knows I've got me quirk. So if I can't fix it, I can at least bring the fella back over to the mainland where he'll be safe and warm and happy until the next day. I agree, of course. I have an art, and it's mostly in the right place. And I know Davy well enough. The man stopped suddenly. His ears pricked, his eyes widened, and he looked out of the window to his right. He began to shout and scream, and then he fell to the floor in what looked like convulsions. Whilst I alerted the staff and suggested they call an ambulance, he slowly came back to his senses, and then asked that I tell them not to call. The landlord gave me a glass of water, and I took it over to him. "None of that. I'm afraid it'll dilute what's already calming me nerves, and I don't want to end up in no hospital, son," he said. "Rather go out here or at me home." He further stated that he wanted to finish his story, and he feared that there was very little time left to do it in. After he refused the water again, I helped him to a very insecure footing. I reassured him that an ambulance wouldn't be phoned, even though I thought it might be good for him to get checked over. Jack and Connor had watched, shocked by the outburst, but had remained silent on the matter. When he seemed well enough again, and when a new bout of trembling had subsided, I quizzed him. I hoped that the questions wouldn't cause another collapse, but couldn't stop myself from asking, "What did you see? What was at the window?" He gently pushed me back a little and shook his head. "Best I don't tell you that, lad." His expression morphed from stony and grave to something softer. "I wouldn't want you to go looking for or spotting what I'm seeing. Besides, I need to finish my story first anyway." On my suggestion, we moved over to the end of the bar that was furthest away from the window, although it was still visible from certain positions. I decided to help him into a corner booth, as the seating was more supportive in case he should have another episode. As soon as he was sat, he continued as though no time had elapsed. "I got in my car and tied the currach to the roof. Didn't take me long to drive down to Hook. You know Hook, right? The lighthouse." I didn't, and I told him so. "Well, not much to know. It's a lighthouse, and a couple of miles from it you got a small island. Just the one house. Old Davy's house. Like living away from the mainland. Didn't like the tourists, especially the English. The apologies. None taken. We're all bastards," I said. The old man smiled. True enough. Jack and Connor came over at this point and asked if I was coming back with them to the bed and breakfast, since we had an early bus to catch the next morning. I said that I would stay for one more and hear out the old man's story. They nodded and left, figuring, as they told me later, that someone should stay and make sure the old man was all right. The bar was getting quieter now, and the old man noticed. He looked around with a smaller amount of the same fear that I had initially seen in him, and began to speak at a quicker pace. "So, away I go in the little currach. It's a still night, so no real trouble out there. No large waves and no wind to take me off my course. Been on much rougher, too rough, and I wouldn't have gone. Could have sent a younger man if that was the case. But at double pay, I was glad he called me. Plus I wanted to check on old Davy, you know, make sure he hadn't gotten himself into any kind of mischief. Even on a mild night, as it were, someone of his age could come down with a bad dose, and a young un might have made bags of the situation. So really it was best all round that I go. I wasn't as fast as I used to be on the currach though, and it took me at least half an hour, maybe a little bit more, to finish the couple of miles and get to the small island. But I got there, alive anyway. Not that there was much questioning that at the time, sea being calm and all, and me being in a fit state. Well, fit enough anyway. Much fitter than you see me in now, you know, after the shaking up I've had. So I pull the currach up onto the land and I look back at our beautiful country. Nothing but darkness though. Since the lighthouse went dark, you don't see much from the islands at night no more. Then I turn to face the small walk. The house is just on the other side of some trees. When they are barren, you can see it, but as we're getting deeper into the spring, they blocked me view. It was strange though. What was? I questioned earnestly. The storm shifted in his eyes. People say it's too quiet, don't they? You ever heard this expression? It's a little too quiet. I nodded. Well, people talk a load of shite, don't they? And I don't really pay them much heed about it, unless I experience it for myself. Otherwise, for all I know, it could be a load of bollocks. But it was, on that night, too quiet. Usually, at all hours and in all conditions, I should be hearing the waves lapping up against the rocky shore, or seabirds circling and squawking. Heck, even on a steady night I should hear some sort of breeze, the islands being so open to the elements and all. But there was nothing. Now, I'm not a man to give himself over to wild fancy. That's not to say I'm a non-believer, mind. I do believe in, dare I say, much more than you ever might. But what I mean to say is, I know some succumb to anxiety pretty easily, and for those I feel sorry. Hellish by all accounts, trapped in your head, not knowing if you're dying or having a panic attack. At this point, I looked down at my watch, not purposefully or out of disrespect, but the old man liked tangents, and the early morning wake-up was drawing closer. God bless 'em, poor buggers, he said, shaking his head. Anyway, as I say, I'm not one for panic or worry without real danger. But there, in that quietness, I came all over in a cold sweat. Like my body knew before my mind that going out there was a mistake. I think my bigger mistake was ignoring them, because I pressed on anyhow, and when I got to the other side of those trees, I cursed bloody murder. What happened? I called, suddenly forgetting the need to leave and eager for the man to alleviate the newly presented suspense. Piss, he returned. What? I need a piss. Get us another whiskey, would you, son? That's a good lad. And with that he was off, although I noted that when he reached the toilet door, he paused for a moment, and his hand was shaky as he pulled it towards him. I went over to the bar and ordered him another Jameson, a double. The landlord asked me if the man was all right. I said that I wasn't sure yet, but assured him that I was talking it through, and he was at least more rational than he had been. At that, the old man exited the toilets, and we returned to our corner. Anyway, as I was saying, when I got to the other side, though, I cursed bloody murder. Why? What happened? Is this the reason why you ran in here in such a state? What did you see? I must admit, I did seem over-eager at this point. I recollect him looking slightly offended, like I was listening to some radio drama and forgetting this was his life. Hardly, lad, but it all leads to it in time, so simmer down just a wee bit until I get there, would you? I apologised. He nodded, and after looking back to the window at the end of the bar for a moment, relief spreading across his features, he was ready to begin again. As I say, I cursed. I first cursed Davy, and then I cursed me boss. I cursed Davy if he hadn't called me boss, and I cursed me boss if Davy had called him, and that lazy twat hadn't called me. Anyway, the reason I was spitting and cursing was that, as I passed through the final row of trees, I could see that the whole house was lit up brighter than a blooming Christmas tree. Every single window was pouring out light. It was as though someone was playing a practical joke. I mean, every perceivable way of lighting up that house was lighting it up. So I cursed until I was blue in the face. But even so, and even though it was bright enough in that part of the island to be viewed from the bloody space station, I couldn't shake off this horrid feeling, and the overwhelming silence. You ever get dread in the pit of your stomach? One that's there for no reason? Yeah, I think I know what you mean, I replied, and the old man nodded. Yeah, well, I've had it a few times through the past, and I'll be damned to hell if those days weren't the worst in me life. It's like I say, son, I don't tend to give myself to flights of fancy, but I do have belief in other stuff, you know. That's why I'd never, even in my wilder youth, stray too far from our Lord and Protector. And good Lord, I need his protection now, so I do. There was a silence that was echoed by the now almost empty bar. The landlord had left his station and was busying himself in a back room. Besides ourselves, there was only one old couple. They were sitting opposite each other at a small, round oak table. Their faces were nothing but lines, and I wondered if looking that old could actually hurt. They were silent too, and judging by the distance placed between them, I assumed the silence extended much longer than on this one particular evening. So, I had this feeling then, and I couldn't shake it, the old man continued. I looked in each of the lit windows, wondering what I should do. The thought of going back onto the open water in my little curragh, what with the dread feeling and all, wasn't seeming too appealing. So instead, I decided to go and knock and see why Davy had called in the first place. You know, see what all this was about. But as I neared the front door, I noticed that it had been left ajar. And with that realisation stinging at my mind, the whole house, and my sen too, were plunged into absolute darkness. The lights turned out, I probed. Aye, son, and I'm not ashamed to say it, but the suddenness and the dread made me whelp. I must have seemed like a truly pathetic beast out there, hollering and wailing and stumbling down to the ground. I was glad no one was there to see it. A momentary loss only, though. As I say, I tend not to give way to panic, but in a real situation, with real peril, I'm no braver than anyone else would be. I composed myself real quick, though, and then started thinking about what might have been the cause of the outage. Obviously, there really was an issue with the electrics, and there'd been no storms. So I figured it could be a problem with either a larger appliance, washing machine, oven, that kind of thing, you know. Or it could be something to do with the fuse box, and maybe Davy kept flicking it back on, only for it to cut back out. If it was to do with the power supply to the island, there was little I could do, mysen, so I settled on trying to find the fuse box first. So, sorry, to clarify, I said, it was pitch black. You were on an island. You'd seen that the door to the only house around was ajar. You were completely by yourself, and you were still thinking about how the electricity had shut off. I asked almost in disbelief at this point. Aye, well, I had a job to do, he stated, matter-of-factly, as though the very idea he should leave and wait until morning hadn't even crossed his mind. And besides, I had a bag with me handy bag. Everything I need in there really is, like me torch, the one I use to look around the outside of the house. Powerful bugger it is too. I shook my head. Didn't you wonder why no one was there to meet you, to come out to your wailing? Didn't you wonder where Davy was, or why the door was open? Aye, yeah, the door did bother me. Couldn't think of why it was ajar. Only thing I could muster was that either Davy had gone to get some air, or he'd left it open for me, and he'd gone to bed or something. Anyway, I called out his name whilst I circled the building. No response, though. Took me a while out there. Problem is, you see, that those houses, the ones on the islands, ain't like your modern houses are now. They ain't uniform. And because they've been built out there, the owners have had more say in building them. Great for the owners, I should expect, but a nightmare for your average trade person like me. You just don't know where the fuse box might be. It could be in the house's head or in its arse. No telling. And my shouting for Davy wasn't helping. But then, all at once, the whole place lit up again. Caught me off guard too, gave me old Ticker a shock and dazzled my eyes for a bit. He stopped for a moment and looked again at the window, at the other end of the bar. This time, he didn't seem quite so relaxed. He turned slowly away, keeping his eyes on it until the last possible moment, before looking back at me. Should have time, I reckon. He saw the quizzical expression that came across me. Time to finish the story. Who knows? Maybe time enough to make it till tomorrow. He looked back at the window and then back at me, the storms in his eyes shifting to a new level of intensity. The door was moving. I could see it, and I could hear it, banging and rattling against its frame. Seemed a poor fit. Either the house had shifted, warping the doorway, or the door had swelled over time. But it banged and it rattled repeatedly without snapping to. Odd thing was this. Though the door was picking up in its ferocity, I swear blind that I couldn't detect the mere suggestion of a breeze. So why then did it move? Why was it moving? I leaned towards him, hands on the table. He leaned forward, matching my intensity with his own. Ain't got a feckin' clue. He laughed and took a deep sip from his glass. His laugh was heartfelt, but brief, as though he had betrayed himself by showing merriment, and he seemed alarmed by his own volume, so much so that he had to check the window several times before continuing. So I goes over to it, not bravely, but slowly, not like a coward neither, but like a regular person, cautious of things that don't usually happen. Sorry to interrupt, I said, but if the lights were on, why didn't you just leave? I mean, frankly, a door moving by itself would be enough for me to leg it all the way to England. He smiled, but did not laugh again. Davy, son. I thought he may have had an accident. Maybe it was him shoving at the door, trying to get me attention. The fact that he hadn't responded to my shouting through an open door into a relatively small house meant that something wasn't right with him. Remember, his well-being, and let's be fair, the pay, were the reasons I went out in the first place. I wasn't going to get all that way and not check on him now, was I? So I went up to the door and I swear, it starts rattling more. And it changes too. It's not hitting the frame anymore, but it's stuck in one place and shaking, rattling, shaking. And the rusty screws pull against the wood, making this god-awful screech. And then, just as I'm thinking maybe I ought to turn back, nothing. Silence. And we are right back to too quiet. Was Davy by the door? Could you see him? I asked. Nothing, son. And after calling his name loudly through the doorway and hearing nothing back but that accursed silence, I started to worry for his safety. Still, I was hoping nothing had happened, and that he was just, acting the maggot. Asking the maggot? My eyebrows drew up into an inquiry. Sorry, messing around, playing the fool. Oh, sorry, I said, not really knowing why I apologised other than out of politeness. So, I think for a moment, either the door's been left open for me, or there's been some trouble and that's why it's open. Either way, I should enter, right? Ain't no trespassing or nothing. It's for Davy's own good, and he'd see that. So I step inside. Now, this ain't no hobbit cave like you probably sat there imagining. To have your own place on your own island, you've got to have some considerable money behind you, and Davy had taste. His taste was younger than his years too, and the place was beautifully modern inside. Too modern for me. I'm stuck in an era of floral patterns, deep browns and heavy oranges, I'm afraid. But it was what was popular when I was younger, That's how the movies and TV shows did up their asses, so that's how we did up ours. Me wife and me, before. Well, just before. And it's how I still do it now. What you think of as modern today will probably be what you keep into your 60s and 70s, and some young folk at the time will call it outdated. Comes around though, doesn't it? I see so many shops these days sprouting up, calling themselves vintage or retro. Comes around and then goes out. How it is. But we each get stuck in a period. Not Davy though. He liked to keep it new, keep it fresh. It would impress the young men he used to entertain, I expect. Make him seem younger and more relatable to them, Davy's gay? I asked ignorantly, expecting anyone from these parts to be a stoic farmer type, or someone for whom repression of any and all desires is a key part of their existence. Oh, I can't say completely, but he's always preferred the affections and company of young men. Surprised he'd ring for an old fool like me to go out there and help him. The old man cast me a wry smile. So, I go in, and as I do, the strangest thing, the door closes behind me. Now, I'm not talking your scary movie slam. I mean your real life could be something natural, slow creak to a close. And I couldn't help but watch it. I was, what's the word? Something, I think. Like hypnotised. Transfixed, I offered. Aye, transfixed, that's it. And I didn't snap out of it until it's fully closed. I don't know what it was, but this feeling of dread was getting worse, almost painful by this point, and I felt a mighty bit sick. So I turned from the door and looked at the familiar stuff that was around. From the hall, you could see the large kitchen and living area. Kitchen had one of them islands, with an electric hob and wine storage. Lovely. Couldn't fit that in my kitchen. Can barely fit my sen in it. Microwave takes up half the counter. Still, lucky, based on my choices to have a roof over my head. What choices? I couldn't resist asking, and he paused. I could see that he was searching his own mind for the right words or scanning through memories. He looked at me sternly. Drugs, lad. I told you that already. Drugs. Cocaine, amongst others. At that, he pulled down his white, wrinkled shirt sleeves, hiding scars. Lost the family, lost the home, lived out there for a bit on the street, But don't let it colour your view of me. I was never a liar. I never hid it, if I was asked straight on it, and I ain't touched it in a long time. It ain't the cause of this story. Not knowing this man, it would have been easy to cast off this recount as an affliction of some lasting mental effects of the drug misuse that he had admitted to. But there was something of earnest, something of absolute truth and beauty about his... what was it? Eyes? There was something that made everything he stated sound and strike me as wholly genuine. Anyway, the drugs and the street are another story, and if that story's for anyone, I'm afraid it's not for you, lad. I didn't say anything, nor did my features, and instead I just waited for him to continue. The lights cut out again, and I couldn't figure it. Nothing was running. In the silence I would have heard it. I doubted it'd be the fuse box, because I couldn't think of nothing that might have shorted it. And even if it had been shorted, then who was turning the lights back on? It had to be the power to the island, or something to do with the wiring outside of the house, I reckoned. But I thought I'd check on the fuses nevertheless. Now, it was a trait of the houses on the other islands to have the boxes, if not outside, up in the attic, or in the utility rooms. Out of the way with the storage, you see. I figured this might be the case here too. The place was well put together, pristine you might say, and any ugly detail as to how an house really functions below all the finery would be hidden away. So I took my torch and took a cursory look around downstairs. I found a small room with a washer and a dryer, but no fuse box, so I made my way up the stairs with a view of going up into the attic. Reaching the top, I scanned the landing with the torch, and that's when I thought I saw something. Around the frame of the furthest door. Fingers. My initial holy shits turned to shouts, because I thought it was Davy, you see. Strange thing though, as soon as I'd spotted him, the fingers, and looking awfully pale too, I might say, they whipped themselves out of sight. I watched the same spot for a time, but I didn't see him again. You didn't run! I would honestly be crapping myself. Why didn't you get out? He could see the disbelief filling me again and took a moment to explain. Look, of course, listening to all this, it's very well to say run and get out, but honestly, you don't know what you're going to think or how you'll react until you're in it for yourself. All I knew was that Davy had rang. I knew Davy personally, and I reckoned it was him needing me help. Now, had I known any more at this point, or had I known anything beyond the dread in my stomach, well, of course I would have fled. And when I realised too late what it actually was in that house, I did flee, tail between my legs and as fast as my arms would row. But as yet, I still thought I was there to help, you know. That's why I didn't run. As for the paleness in the fingers, well, that only made me reckon Davy was more ill than I imagined. What he said made sense, I supposed. But really, running through the situation in my own mind, I found it hard to believe that I would stay after seeing fingers wrapped around a doorframe and then disappearing into the darkness, as if that of some watching spectre. I shivered and let the man continue. So, I turned the corner into the furthest room. Spare it was, and only a small one at that. I cast my torch around, but it's the damnedest thing. There's no one in there. Then I get this feeling. This horrible feeling of being watched from above. And though, as I say, I don't take much notice of wild fancy, I get this real strong feeling something is above me, in the corner of the room, and I slowly bring my torchlight up to it. What was there? I couldn't help but call out. Nah, nothing. Load of bollocks. I was just being afraid of the dark. And although I could have sworn I saw those fingers, I started telling myself that it was only the shadows dancing in the torchlight and these old eyes starting the tricks of age. Told myself it could have been floaters. So I leave the room and I get back into the hallway. I point my torch up and I see the way into the loft. Only a small little square, but big enough for an adult, or at least an adult that hasn't been indulging in too many drops of the black stuff. I also spot a long stick with a hook at the end, propped up in one of the corners of the hall. No doubt Davy used it to open the loft hatch and pull down the folding ladders. Now, don't get me wrong, I hadn't given up that Davy might be somewhere in the house, and as I was doing all this, I kept calling out his name at points, But there was no return on me calls, you see, and I figured that it would be better to search if I could see what I was doing. So I opened up the hatch and I pulled down the ladder. Then I made me way up into the attic. No sooner was I up there when the old house flooded with light again. Gave me a start, but only a small one. The old man paused and looked hard at his remaining whiskey. He looked back at me. Top me up, would you, lad? This next part's going to be hard to get through, and I fear the whiskey ain't. I replenished his glass and bought myself one for good measure. Then I returned to the table. Just take your time, I said. There's no need to rush. At this, he almost chortled, but instead he took a quick glance over at the window and then took a deep draught. I took a look over too, and couldn't help myself from imagining cold, pale fingers wrapping around the frame of the window. I almost gave myself chills. The next thing I knew, boy, was pain. All-consuming, maddening pain. It felt like I'd been struck around the head by something heavy. Heavy enough to kill a man. But there was no strike. I hadn't been hit. It was a scream. A deafening, eardrum-shattering wail. So powerful and so diabolical it was that it sent me head swirling, and all I knew was searing agony. Made me want to be sick. As the pain subsided, lad, it was replaced, at first by a stronger dread than I've ever felt, and then unparalleled fear, for I knew the scream. I'd heard it before. The man began biting at his thumbnails and rubbing his fingers hard at his eye sockets as he did. It looked like he was trying to push his fingers right into his brain and scrub away at the memories. You'd heard it before? He kept his eyes tightly closed. Aye, on the Aran Islands. I was there fixing telephone lines of all things, and I heard her. Thing was, back then, there were others around. They heard her too, and she wasn't there for me, but I still fled just as soon as I could. There's only one creature on the whole of this earth that makes a sound like that. Like what? I pressed. I can't describe it, son. It's like an emotion. All of the most dreadful emotions you can muster, wrapped up into a sound that pulls at your very soul. Words have no mastery of it. You can only know if you hear it, and I pray to our God for your soul that you never have to. What was it? I pressed again. Banshee. His eyes burst open, alight with terror. Banshee, son. And you know what they say about banshees, don't you? I can't say that I do, and my tone betrayed me at this point, for when he named it, when he actually gave a name to the subject of his supernatural recount, I found it just a little too magnificent to believe. He spotted it right away, and was flushed with an abrupt rage. "To hell with you then!" he bellowed, almost knocking the table as he stood. "I needn't finish! I can see I've left very little of an impression on you. Too ignorant and too close-minded." "Wait," I said, feeling apologetic, but not knowing how to react. Surely, I remember thinking, he couldn't expect me to just believe in so wild a tale. And yet, what harm was there in going along with it, being swept in by it, if it would appease the old man and give him some comfort? Please, wait. It's not that I don't believe you, it's just... Come on. I've never seen the slightest hint of the supernatural. It's just hard to take in is all. The old man snapped out of his fury with a sudden look of alarm. He turned back to face the window as if checking if his outburst had given him away to whatever he believed lurked out there. "Sorry, lad. I just don't want you to think of me as a rambling fool," he said, lowering himself back to his seat, but keeping his eyes fixed on the window until I spoke again. "Well, no matter what you say, I don't think that." "Thank you," he smiled, and it was about as heartfelt as I felt he could summon. "So, banshees, what do they say about them?" I asked. He took a deep breath. "They say if you see a banshee, it means certain death." After he said this, he took on a new visage, One I hadn't seen before, one of tiredness, resignation and defeat. As I said, I had heard the one on the Aran Islands. But that is the distinction. Heard her, you see. Heard her. You can hear a banshee and flee with your life, long as you don't look at 'em. But hearing the scream alone is terrible enough. I wish I could make you understand the horror of that cry, and yet I wish with all my heart that you never have to. When I heard it in that attic, I was trembling, much like I was trembling when I first passed through these here doors. I ain't ashamed to say it, but I was crying. I was scared, son. But I remembered, you see, I remembered me own grandpappy telling me that if you see a banshee, if you see it, it means certain death. And that was me hope. The lights were on now, so I knew what I had to do. What? I demanded, again becoming consumed by his words. I had to make it out of the house and back to my curragh. Heck, I might have had to make it all the way back to the mainland, with me eyes closed. Long as me eyes stayed closed, I couldn't see her, and I thought, at that point, that I may have just outsmarted her. So I closed me eyes, and I tried to leave. It was about that time that the storm kicked up. Oh, nothing too large, but not forecast and odd, you know. Howling wind, some heavy rain, but from nowhere and filling the house with haunting, hollow sounds that echoed around me. I moved towards the ladder and almost fell out of the loft hatch, just catching myself before I did, but holding me eyes tightly shut. Then pain, searing, pounding and horrifying pain tore through me again, and this time I did fall. The old man lifted his tattered shirt to reveal that his skin underneath was bruised with the deepest blacks and purples. I think I gasped. I fell hard, and both me side and me head was thick with pain, but it wasn't worth me life, son, so I kept me eyes closed. It made me realise, you know, why all those horror movies and stories are set in the dark. You know what the most terrifying thing was about having me eyes closed? She could have been right in front of me, and I wouldn't have had a fecking clue. And that, more than most anything else at that moment, was utterly terrifying. The not knowing, the not seeing, the darkness. I tell you, that's true fear. I kept going though. I refused to let her get me. If I didn't open my eyes, if I didn't see her, then she had no power over me, I figured. I pulled me wretched body up as best I could and dragged it along the hallway. I put my right foot out in front of me and felt my way to the top of the stairs. And there I waited. Pain again, but this time I was prepared. I had a feeling, a gut feeling along with a dread, that she wanted me to fall, wanted me to knock me head and knock open me eyes. But I had been too shrewd, I reckoned. I held onto the rail and kept me set upright until she stopped. The pain drifted off slowly and I began to make my way down the staircase. One that definitely had more steps going down than it had coming up. But finally, I had my hand upon the handle of the door. I was so close to a breath of relief, so close to fleeing to my boat, that I almost dared to dream I'd make it out. But then she did it. She screamed, son. The man's eyes flooded with tears, and he cast his vision down to his glass. The scream was so close that it caught me off guard. So close I could feel her breath in my ear, and I couldn't help it. Oh, I begged my body not to do it. I begged God not to let it happen, but it was like the sound alone was peeling back my eyelids. They sprang open, and I was a fecking dead man. There she was, almost floating above me and looking down at me poor doomed spirit. Her eyes were dark and vacuous, except for two luminous orbs that seemed to float in the dark oval eternities. Her mouth was just as vacuous as her eyes, but wider, studded all round with sharp, pointed rows of teeth. And although there was barely a shape to it beyond emptiness, there came this feeling, that she was giving me a sickening smile. Her skin was taut around thin muscle, and the flesh was of a bluish tinge. I recognised her long, bony fingers from the door frame, but they seemed more skeletal than I had remembered. She had no fingernails, and the flesh at the end oozed with dark liquid. But none of this was the worst of what she was. The worst was knowing that taking in any vision of this accursed creature was looking at my own death. She reached towards me, and my body became stone, petrified. I managed to close my eyes again, but it was too late. I couldn't unsee what I'd seen, and then, I shouted, but the old man didn't even flinch. He didn't seem to even notice I was there anymore. He took another sip of Jameson and blankly continued. She took off my shirt. Softly. Softest and gentlest touch you've ever felt. Like a mocking pity. And then came the sounds of splashing water. I opened my eyes, searching out the sound. I'd seen her after all. The only reason I'd closed them was to shut out some of the horror. But I wanted to see if I was right about why she'd taken my shirt. And I was. Been here. They say they wash the clothes of those about to die, and she washed mine. Once finished, she put it into the sink and moved out of the room, leaving me alone on the floor. Then what? Then what happened? I shouted more forcefully, and this roused him enough to look up at me. What then? Then I had to leave. I had to spend the next hour alone in the darkness waiting to die, thinking I'd never see life again, never again talk to someone else. She left me alone, and I fled. I could see him there, in my mind's eye, and imagined how utterly terrible it must have been for this man. Reality or not, he believed he had seen these things, and the suffocating fear he would have felt must have been unbearable. First was the terror of making it across the tiny island, constantly looking over his shoulder, every second wondering if he would make it to his boat alive. Then, in the thick darkness and pouring rain, he had to row alone for over 30 minutes, with his eyes fixed on the island, every moment expecting the beast to emerge from the shadows, to grasp him and to swallow him whole. When he made it to the land, there was the sheer vulnerability he must have had to endure before fumbling out his car keys, wondering if his delay and manic attempts to place them into the slot brought the thing closer, brought his death closer. Finally, there was the drive up the darkened road towards the pub, and, no doubt, he would have been peering constantly in the rear view mirror, waiting for her skeletal hands to reach up from the darkness of the back seat and throttle him in his chair. Even the run from the car to the bar door must have felt like an ordeal without end. The horror of it all was not just in the viewing of the creature, but in every moment he had spent alone since. And, just as I was about to console myself by the thought that at least now he was warm and amongst company, his eyes began to widen. He rose from the corner bench, stepping forwards, and pointed madly, his face drained of all the colour that had been slowly returning to him. "No! I'm not ready!" he howled, looking out of that small dark window, and for a moment, caught up in the hysteria and drama of this strange evening, I thought, for the faintest flickering of a second, that I glimpsed something wavy, silvery and smoke-like, and then a flash of two glowing orbs, almost eyes. "Begone, she-devil! I call out your name, Banshee! I call out your name, Benir! And with these I command you to depart! You'll not have me! I am strong and I ain't ready! So with your name I cast you out! With the names of Jesus Christ and the Holy Father, God himself, I cast you out! I am protected by the Lord and by the Holy Spirit and by Jesus Christ! My soul resides with them and I am protected. You will not have me! You will not have my life! You will not have me! He stopped, barely drawing breath, and stared for a long time at the gathering gloom. His eyes remained fixed and unblinking for many more minutes before he began to utter the words. I think that worked. I think... But he was cut off by his own manic and blood-curdling screams. Screams I had never before, nor never since, heard another human make. She's inside. She has me. I can't escape. She's death. She proclaims death. She brings my death. And holds it out to me in her blue, withered hands. I'm dead. I could do nothing but stare at the old man in horror. Can you not feel her breath at your neck? Can you not perceive the cascading wires of hair that brushes at your arms? Can you not feel that skeletal hand that reaches right through your chest? For God's sakes, man, she's behind you! I turned immediately, and though I both perceived nothing nor saw nothing, I was shaken, and my body became chilled all over, bursting into gooseflesh. When I turned back to face the old man, which I did slowly and with an immovable caution, he was gone. The only trace of him left being a half-finished whiskey and the slight movement of the front door closing to. I did not dare walk back to the bed and breakfast that evening, and instead had the landlord call me a taxi. It had to come over from Wexford town, and it wasn't cheap. But I was thankful for the company, and I gave him €10 extra to wait outside of the small inn, until he saw I was inside, and the front door was closed. The following morning, I managed to delay my party's travels by one day. They thought it was foolish, but I wished to make some short inquiries within the local area. After speaking with folks around Templetown, Fetard, and some of the other small regions of County Wexford, I gathered the following. Davy insisted that he had never made a call that indicated any loss of power, and was in fact not on the small island that night. Instead, he was drinking and staying with a friend on the mainland. The old man's boss, Arthur, swore blind that it was Davy that had called, and couldn't possibly have been someone posing as him. He knew the voice well. However, Arthur noted two very odd things. The first was that the call had been very distorted, as if by a strange static, but a static that sounded almost like a wheezing, or at times a fuzzy electrical sobbing. The second was that, try as he might, he could not locate a call record from the previous evening, other than when he had called the old man. Further to this, in speaking with some of the locals closer to the coast, several of them reported hearing a sombre sound drifting in from the sea, like the call of a dying whale, but more haunting, more terrible. Finally, after knocking on the door and ringing the bell of the old man's flat, and receiving no answer, I spoke with many people in Fetard, and none had seen him return home. His car remained at the Dewdrop Inn, and his curragh remained on the shore unclaimed. To this day, and it has been several years since, I often wonder about the man, and hope that it was merely some delusion of the mind that he had seen that night, and often think that all else could probably be put down to coincidence or trickery. However, and when not trying to ease my own mind, I feel more strongly that what the man had said was truth, and that those terrible tones that sailed hauntingly across the sea that evening were the vile vocal notes of the vision he had seen on the small island. And of his life, I try not to speculate, because each time I do, my heart inexplicably begins to quicken, and in my mind's eye I begin to see a picture of the creature he described, a creature who grasps my own clothes in its bluish withered hands. At this point, I immediately stop thinking and push anything relating to this tale from my mind, for that is an image I hope to never fully conjure. Thank you for listening to my tale here at the Horror Story Corner. I hope you can join us next time for our next foray into dread. Until then, pleasant dreams. Hello, Fear fans, and welcome to this, the Horror Story Corner, where today we have a new, wholly original tale. This is my most recent piece, and one that is grounded more in reality than my usual work. As such, I must warn you that there are certain segments of this tale that are suggestive of murder and sexual violence. Therefore, listener discretion is advised. That said, I hope you enjoy. He Has a Way. I sat at platform 1. Nothing had made me take the seat which I took. Well, nothing consciously, at the very least. From it, I looked over platform 2, not really thinking anything specifically, but pausing for a moment from thought to simply observe the other side. I used to do it a lot when I was younger. I would sit and just notice that I was alive, notice that I was present, and then notice everything around me in that moment that was present too. It was grounding, and it made me feel more connected to the earth. I needed connection when I was younger, and so it quelled me. It was as though by noticing I was here, it made the feeling that I was here stronger. At times, I felt that if I didn't notice myself, then I might not exist, and that used to terrify me. As we get older, and as we get given more responsibilities, I'm speaking generally of course, I think we lose this ability of noticing to some degree. It's understandable as our existence instead becomes defined by our job role, our children, our wealth, the size of our cars, our houses, and so on. Don't get me wrong, though. Capitalism's quest isn't entirely consuming. On occasion, we're drawn from our thoughts to appreciate beauty, and this beauty is usually something very small, like a cool breeze running across an otherwise stuffy room, a butterfly flapping delicately into our vision, or something equally insignificant, that pulls us away and makes us notice that we are alive for a short while. It's nice, though, when we can find the time to make these thoughtless, present periods longer. So whilst I could, I took a moment to observe and be present, but even that eventually turns back into thought. There was nothing special or interesting about the train station. In fact, if anything, it was tired, a little dull, and ugly. 2 ramps with iron railings led down to the long tarmac-coated platforms. There was no graffiti, and the signage was clean, sharp and new, but it was just lifeless. The shelters, which were identical on both sides, were held up by black-painted steel girders, with the ones that ran parallel to the roof having diamond patterns cut into them to make them look less industrial and harsh. It didn't work. I found that areas around Birmingham and Birmingham itself were better when they embraced their hardened, industrial, red brick face. That is honest, and there is more beauty in honesty. The people on Platform 2 were insignificant, tired creatures, almost grey in their complexions. There was a man, drunk and slobbering utterings into his phone. He paced forwards and backwards and hobbled slightly as he did. The others on the platform paid him no attention, and eventually, after several loud profanities and mumbled curses towards the Lord, he ended the call and sat on the last bench on the left. There were 3 other people on the platform. One stood slightly out of the shelter, smoking, and the other 2 sat in chairs with one empty space between them. They were looking down into their phones, and it amused me. Close, but worlds apart. My mind wandered back to the days of school, where we were given strange, juxtaposing life lessons regarding others. We were taught that in order to do well in the future, it was vital we should be sociable and confident in public situations. However, it was also equally important to remember to never talk to strangers, and that if we met someone in life who was friendly, yet unknown to us, they most definitely had ulterior motives. We were taught that being a team player and working with those around us is important to succeed. And in the following lesson we were taught that the world is vicious. It is dog eat dog, and in order to survive we must be competitive. We must come first. We must strive to win. We are taught to love our neighbours, to hold others close, but to sit silently during assemblies and pretend we have nothing in the world to say to our friends who are literally sitting right beside us. Otherwise, we'd be scolded, not literally, put on the warning board, be ridiculed in front of a procession of others. We were taught that talking to one another was a vital skill, and yet drilled into us was the fear of speaking in our classrooms. Paradoxically, we would learn about our rights and our freedom of speech, yet our freedom was only allowed at certain times and in certain situations. And this was the result. Someone talking through a phone screen, whilst not daring to look at a real person sat beside them. "Don't you dare talk in assembly! Don't you dare talk in the train station!" It was sad to see just how far away these people were from each other, and yet physically they were so close. I wondered, if not for our enforced stoic nature, would we have more lovers, more friends? Have I been sat next to the person who could understand me most in this world, and instead of talking to them, took out my phone and liked someone else's comment on my social media wall? It was at this point that I began to notice the girl beside me, and pondered whether my chosen position was not more deliberate than I had perceived. It was a hot summer's day, hot enough for shorts, but being early, it was not yet uncomfortably warm. I saw her legs out of the corner of my eye. They were long and bare, pale, but I liked that. I moved my vision slightly, trying not to be obvious. She was wearing jean shorts, and on her lap sat a lunchbox with a leafy salad and pieces of meat. It must have been boring, as I was sat right next to her and couldn't detect any odour that would suggest flavour. I didn't judge her too harshly on that, though. Whilst an interesting lunch is, well, interesting, it doesn't do anything for a figure, and if her legs were anything to go by, other areas of her physique would probably be quite good too. Diet culture may not have long-term goals, but in the short, I was thankful for many of the results. Here, though, my curiosity was piqued, and not being at all a coward, I turned immediately to take her in. She wore a light-coloured denim jacket that suited and didn't jar against the darker shorts. Below it was a cute little yellow button-down blouse with a faux lace white neckline. She wore gold-rimmed spectacles that were slightly too large for her, and ones I suspected weren't prescription. From her complexion I placed her at about 25, and I am good with ages, so I think I was accurate. She had full lips, but a cute, toothy smile, and her breasts were well proportioned but not overstated. She was symmetrical, and I appreciate symmetry. Others may prefer quirks, and in some respects I do, but I feel a woman should be symmetrical if they are to be called beautiful, and she was beautiful. I let my vision linger for too long, and she caught me staring. Now, most people would be shy at this point. They would turn away and pretend that they weren't looking, that their stares were merely passing by on the way back from looking at something else. Not me, though. I kept my eyes on hers, and I smiled. I smiled long enough that she bashfully smiled back and looked down towards her food. I had caught it, though. I had seen an indication in her pupils. They dilated minutely, and that was all I needed. I knew she was attracted to me, and why not? I've always been attractive to the opposite sex. I've always found it easy to get what I need, whether it be sex or companionship, or even, if my tastes strayed further, I would be aptly provided. Yet, it is always thrilling when a new person should deem you attractive, and from her short glance I could tell she did. I used to consider in the mirror what exactly it was that women found attractive in me, as I am not conventionally handsome, and though I seek symmetry, I am far from symmetrical. I have a nice smile, my brown eyes are deep, and my hair is well looked after. I always smell nice, and I have good teeth. However, I believe it's more to do with the confidence. They sense what's inside me. They see my nature, and they can't help it. They are drawn to it. They can't resist. It's natural. Animalistic. A message called out from a nearby speaker. The 8:50 train to Stratford-upon-Avon calling at Birmingham Snow Hill has been delayed due to strike action. The next train arriving at Platform 1 will be the West Midlands train to Birmingham Moor Street at 9:33. The girl next to me sighed, and I saw a way into conversation. Need to get somewhere? I asked, again smiling at her. She shot a small smile towards me, not as large or as bashful as the previous one. I'm just meeting someone. I don't like to be late. Ha! I laughed. You should tell that to some of my female friends. Why, I've got one who you can guarantee no matter what time she tells you, she'll be at least 3 hours late. Her little smile returned, and I thought I detected a small laugh. It might have been to appease, and appease it did. She was incredibly cute, and I found myself very quickly attracted to her, but I was a calm man. I could control myself outwardly, and I knew how to rein in the intensity. So I paused the conversation and waited for the right amount of time to pass. I waited until it felt right. I waited until I could feel her wanting me to speak again. She didn't make a show of it. There was no turning of her head, no slight cough or verbal indication, but I knew. I'm good at knowing how others feel. I'm good at reading them precisely, and I'm good at knowing when to act. I could feel her wanting me to turn, wanting me to speak again, and I left it. I left her wanting me. I looked down at the navy and rose gold watch that ticked the minutes away on my wrist, and smiled broader as they passed, because I knew each one made her want my words more. I could smell her perspiration, felt it dripping down her chest, and still lower. I could hear her thoughts crying out, "Why hasn't he spoke to me again? Surely he feels this connection between us. There isn't long until the next train. Oh God, Anthony, please talk to me." And I'm not a cruel man. At this point, when she really needed me to speak, when she was teetering but not yet careering off the edge, I did. What do you do, if you don't mind me asking? I kept it so cool. This was perfect. Asking about work, making sure that we don't stray too far too soon. She'd see that I was a gentleman, see that I'm not one to jump to my impulses or instincts, even though it was clear that we were both feeling them, both feeling electricity. She feigned annoyance, feigned reservation about talking to me, and I liked the way she played the game, but she answered because she had to answer. There was a need in her. She was drawn to me, and I wanted her. I'm an archivist. Not that you want to know much about that. It's boring, really. I was enchanted by her modesty and couldn't hold back. Archivist? How could that possibly be boring? You hold by the very role volumes and collections of history. You are a keeper of civilizations that, without your touch, would wither into dust and be forgotten by the minds of all men. And women, she added with a smile, and I had to very quickly hide the look that I felt seeping into my features. There was more silence between us, and at first I was a little downhearted, even maddened, that she hadn't shown me the same respect by asking what I did. That was until her eyes stole across to me, and told me, in no uncertain terms, the game she was playing. She wasn't asking, not because she was uninterested, but because she wanted me to chase. She wanted me to act. They really are very similar when it comes down to it, I suppose. She wanted a brute, forceful in his want, and that is what I delivered. "Dinner," I said, full of confidence and hardly looking in her direction. It felt much less a question, and more an order. "What?" she asked, pretending coyly that she hadn't seen this coming. I knew otherwise. "Dinner, tonight, after you're done with your friend in the city. I can meet you at 8 if you like. I know a place that does excellent pho. Casual, but excellent. I'm sorry." she uttered, looking over at me, and just as I was about to set the meeting in stone, as I believe she truly wanted, she added, "It's my boyfriend that I'm meeting in town." I flushed red, and my eyes fixed on her. She saw the heat in them. Not anger. I must stress, I'm never driven by anger. Never. It was heat. Briefly, though, I could detect fear from her, so I corrected myself and forced the true emotion out of my face. "Oh," I said, this time doing the feigning myself. "I do apologize for bothering you." Utter shit! I wasn't bothering her. She wanted it, and I knew it. I'd known it since we looked at each other, and she knew it too. So why then should she put this obstacle in the way? It didn't endear me to her. How could I be endeared to a slut? It didn't make me want her any more. Less so, in fact. Who would want someone who has been used up and tainted? So why did she say it? Why would she say it? Why? What was this messed up game she was playing? Before I could get completely lost deep within myself, a million miles away from the thoughtless peace I had experienced upon my arrival, the train pulled up to the platform, and she got on. I followed her, and sat a few seats away, in a position that made it difficult to see her. Difficult, but not impossible, thanks to her reflection in the window. As I watched her, she took out a book from her bag and began to read, obviously finding any excuse to not trace her vision along the train to seek me out. Soon, however, she became truly engrossed in the book she was reading. I saw it wrought on her delicate face. Fear, sadness, maybe a touch of anger, and then I became intrigued. I was intrigued by what she was reading, but the reflection in the window was too faint, and the distance made it impossible for me to see clearly. I got up and moved past her. The way that she was facing meant that I couldn't get a clear look at the book as I moved down towards the restroom, without having to look back at her. If I did this, I would appear needy, and neediness never succeeds. But on the way back, I saw it. I saw both the book, and I saw her eyes. They were flirty, and they were happy to see me. They were smiling at me. Those eyes and that book, the bitch. I didn't like this game. Why would she do this? Why would she read 1984 in front of me? The one book that would turn lust and desire into love and destiny. The one book that brought my soul to life. A tale of restraint, of hope, love and defiance that slowly morphs into one of fear, hopelessness and utter despair. It is the only book I've ever thrown across the room in rage, and that is the most glowing and affectionate a review I can ever hope to give anything. It made me feel. But just like the rats held out in front of Winston Smith, this book being held out in front of me was done so in some sick and twisted manner. I was being presented with all I could ask for in a creature: beauty, intelligence, and taste, and yet she had wedged between us a boyfriend. Why? Why would she do this to me? Did she want to destroy my last hope, my resilience? To tease me with all that she was and leave me empty and frustrated? No. I could see the want in her eyes. I knew that she knew we were meant to be two. So why? Then it struck me. I had been an absolute fool, almost descending into madness over something really so simple. The game hadn't changed. It was the same. She only wanted more action than I had given, and of course she did. Such a prize is not so easily won. They just want action. She wanted me to fight for her, to prove what she already knew, that whoever this boyfriend was, if he was real at all, I was superior. I was the clear choice. I was exactly what she needed. Gleeful in my summation, I took my seat and waited. At Birmingham Snow Hill she alighted, and that was my cue. It was time to be assertive, to give her the love scene she required. "Wait!" I called after her, hiding the sheer delight I was experiencing. She turned. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "I'm sorry," I said. Not sorry at all, but carefully gauging her reactions and taking my time in the words that I chose. This is crazy. I know it is. I know you can't just hop off a train at a stop that is definitely not the one I wanted, by the way, and call after a cute girl who already has a relationship. I know that it's mad, and I know I shouldn't do it. I wasn't mad, and we both knew I had to do it. I could see in the curves of her mouth, in the position of her body, open and waiting. Even in the way that both her feet pointed directly towards me, she was receptive. This was working. She needed me. "Well, yes," she laughed. "This is a bit mad, and it's kind of cute. But I meant it. I'm seeing someone." She was softening. She was giving me the chance. She was allowing me to win her. "I know," I said. "And usually that would be that, and I wouldn't dream of doing anything so impulsive. But I just feel like... And I know we've just met, but I feel like there could be something good here. It's strange, but I feel this connection. Besides, I'm seeing someone too." This was the complete wrong thing to say. Her expression changed to frustration in an instant. "That doesn't make it right! Jesus!" she howled, and for a moment became very ugly to me. "That makes it worse! I've got to go!" She turned to storm off, but I hadn't lost yet. I took her hard by the arm and then loosened my grip immediately, hoping she didn't detect how forcefully I wanted to pull her towards me. "Is it serious with him?" She turned back. "You have a girlfriend. What does it matter?" "See, I shouldn't have said that. You're right. But we aren't serious. Not really. We haven't been together long at all, and I would never usually chase someone whilst with someone else, but I've just never met anyone like you. Sorry, that sounds crazy. I just mean, it's odd, you know. I just feel something here. Don't you?" I saw her soften again. "Please. Is it serious?" "Not yet," she said, and gave me a route way back in. I smiled. I couldn't help smiling, and she called me out on it, which made me smile more. "So," I said, "if you and him aren't serious, and if my relationship isn't serious, why don't we go out for dinner tonight?" "No," she returned, and suddenly I began to feel as though I was being toyed with, and I bit down hard on my tongue to suppress what I wanted to say. But luckily, she continued, "Not tonight, but if you were single, I might think about making myself available too." At this point there was a look in her eyes, a look I was familiar with. She was taking me in, and very visibly wanting me. It was lust, and I gave her the same look in return. "Okay, done. Let me have your number, and I'll let you know the moment I'm single, which, believe me, won't be very long." At this she giggled, and her whole soul became somewhat lighter. They always tend to when they finally stop playing and relent. She pressed her name, Emily, into my phone slowly, and as she did, I imagined her fingers tracing my skin, her nails pressing into my flesh, drawing fresh blood. After we had exchanged numbers and she was out of sight, I crossed to the opposite platform. I had planned to collect some items for a romantic night with my partner, but I no longer wanted that. I wanted my relationship over. I wanted it over tonight. There was no way I would let it linger on. Every moment that my new love was away from me was a moment she could get closer to her current boyfriend, and I didn't want to even contemplate that. My separation had to be tonight. Outside of my house, I hesitated. I knew she'd be in there waiting for me, and usually I wouldn't end things so soon, so suddenly. But you can't control love. You never know when it might happen, and surely she would understand that. Surely Rachel could see that doing it for love is too pure a reason not to. I entered the house, and after locking the door and securing the 2 bolts, I placed my keys in the bowl beneath the mirror. I looked at myself. I had a kind-looking face, and I had kind eyes, deep, brown, and kind. I supposed the kindness made it easier. Looking back down, I took a second set of keys from the bowl and moved to the kitchen. I went over to the countertop. It was a mess, but I would clean it. I would clean the whole place once Rachel had gone. I would make it perfect for Emily. I took the longest and sharpest knife that I had, and then made my way to the basement door. I unlocked it and moved into the darkness. Rachel didn't make a sound. She couldn't make a sound. I had made sure of that. She could barely breathe. I took her into my arms, and momentarily felt something of the original passion I had for her, before Emily's easy beauty had drained it so thoroughly. Then I cried. I really did think there was more to Rachel, and when I had met her, I thought our time together would be longer than it had been. I cried for the time we no longer had together, cut short by a truer love, and in a way, I suppose I cried for Rachel herself. She was young after all, and I'm not a monster. I have a soul and feelings. If I had known about my upcoming chance meeting with Emily, I may not have even taken her. Although the more honest part of myself knew I probably still would have. I lifted the knife, feeling her sob and shake below me, and set about my task. When it was done, everything was silent, save for my own heavy, and I must admit, slightly excited breathing. But that too soon began to quell, when suddenly there was a vibration, and my immediate thought was that Rachel had somehow survived. However, I nearly laughed out in joy at my absurdity when I realized it was nothing more than my phone that had given me the start. I pulled it out of my pocket and unfolded it. The name Emily flashed across the screen, and I felt my heart begin to quicken. The excitement in my stomach rose. The message read, "You ended it yet?" And she had placed an emoji at the end with its tongue poking out. I wanted to taste that tongue. I typed in my reply. It read, "Yes, I did." I placed here in the center of the message a winking face and added the words, "When is our first date?" I put 2 kisses at the end and no more. After all, I didn't want to seem too eager. I pressed send. Then I sat there, and as her reply buzzed and the screen lit up my heavily blood-soaked face, I smiled. Thank you for joining me today, listeners. Oftentimes, the most terrifying of tales are not rooted in the supernatural, but instead stem from the everyday, the evils that occur within the natural world, evils from the twisted and terrible minds of those around us, who may act upon sickening desires or grim impulses, people who find amusement or even pleasure from the pain and suffering of others. And this is a terror that is sadly not solely existent within the realms of the Horror Story Corner. Good night. Hello, Fright fans, and welcome over to the Horror Story Corner, where today we are again celebrating another milestone in the life of the channel. We've just reached 250 subscribers, putting us a quarter of the way towards 1,000, and I would personally like to thank everyone who has subscribed so far. I've been overwhelmed by the response to what is a passion of mine. It is wonderful to build a community of horror fans who share a love of creepy and horrifying short tales of the macabre. Today, and in response to our milestone, I will be sharing another original tale. This tale is the first short horror story that I ever wrote, and is entitled The Chair. It's a fiendishly frightening and cautionary tale about a man named Arthur, who is interested in accumulating fortune and very little else. He attends the sale of a recently deceased woman's belongings. There is nothing of value there, and he decides to leave. Before he can, however, he is stopped by a man with a proposition. He will give Arthur a large sum of money in exchange for taking away a rudimentary chair, one that doesn't come alone but with a ghost story. Little does he realize the acquisition of such an item will cost him much more than the sum he receives, and will place him right here, before us, in the Horror Story Corner. Please let me know what you think to the story in the comment section below, and if you enjoy what you hear, or if you enjoy any of the other classic horror stories on the channel, then please think about subscribing. There will be further original stories as we hit further milestones, and a live reading of one of my favourite stories that I've written, The Tour, if we can make it to 1,000 subscribers. For now, though, I hope you enjoy The Chair. An eldritch feeling tingled through Arthur as he slowly awoke. He was groggy and unsure of his surroundings. The air was laden with a thick mustiness, and his body ached. It was clear from the pain in his back and neck that he had rested there for some time. Blood fought its way down to his extremities and brought them back from a cold numbness. Blinking several times to regain focus, he noticed the southwesterly view that extended outward from the large Victorian windows. He was in his attic, yet he had no recollection of why he had come, nor any valid reasoning for being there. He stood with some difficulty, and could barely feel his legs through persistent icy tingles. Once some function had returned, he carefully made his way over to the window. It had not been properly cleaned for a good portion of time, and it was clear that the layers of dust were fighting their best to obscure any sight beyond the glass. So much for a maid to help with the housework, he thought, scratching his nail down the window pane and coating it thoroughly in grime. Whispered an ethereal voice, which doubled the icy chill throughout his veins and tugged sharply at his gut. Arthur lived alone, and so the presence of any other voice was an unwelcomed one. He turned and surveyed the room, but it stood completely empty. At the sight of the nothingness, and with its unbroken continuation, his thundering heartbeat began to quell. He eventually reasoned that the voice had been so delicate, so diffuse, that it may have been nothing more than a lingering call from some fading dream. He rubbed his eyes with the knuckles of his index fingers and then took in the room anew. It was spare in every sense of the word. It had remained for years completely unfurnished, and with no particular purpose or function to speak of. Having no family, and even fewer visitors, and the house already allowing ample space for items acquired over Arthur's many years in buying and selling, the attic was pointless. It was strange, then, that he should awake here. as, try as he might, Arthur could not recall the last time he had entered this room, let alone spent any significant portion of time in it. Then, and almost as though it merged suddenly into his reality, his attention turned and centered on the sole item besides himself that occupied the space. The object gained more corporeality. He hated the chair. Although he thought that the term chair was too solid a description for it, it was abstract if he was feeling generous, and he was not a generous man. Undeniably, though, and more so over the years in his possession, there came in, viewing the thing, an odd feeling, preternatural and unsettling. In terms of its physical presence, it was little more than a poorly sanded tree stump, varnished dark with some chemical that had given it a peculiar purple sheen, hammered along one half of the circumference with crude iron spikes about 2 inches between each one, and all measuring different lengths. This provided somewhere uncomfortable to lean, which suited the uncomfortable, splinter-riddled seat. There were no carvings. There was no fabric to soften its edges. Nothing of beauty or redeeming about the whole of its composition. The thing looked more like some unfurnished torture device than it did a place to rest, and the thought that he had awoken in it suddenly chilled Arthur, although he could not place exactly why. Normally he would not have taken in such an object, but the chair had come with a story, and the man who told it had been quite adamant that it should leave with Arthur. He had first come across it in an irregular fashion, having attended a sale at an elderly woman's house upon her passing, though the location of acquisition itself was not odd. Earlier in his life, Arthur had been to many of these kinds of sales, as well as any other one may imagine. He was a collector and seller of various curiosities, and keenly believed in finding hidden treasures in the most unassuming of places. On this particular day there was nothing of interest, however, and he had settled on leaving. Structurally, the house was in no state of disrepair, but the lady owner must have had some strange habit of hoarding inconsequential stacks of peculiarities. As such, Arthur found himself digging his way through a particularly large stack of old local newspapers to clear a passage in the direction of the door. Before he could make it, he was confronted by the woman's beneficiary. "Leaving, sir?" the faceless mass inquired. Faceless in Arthur's memory, anyway. Arthur had a knack for recalling very minute details of conversation and tone. He could also detect a deep meaning from seemingly insignificant facial expressions. All of these could reveal the shortest route to an acquisition or profitable sale. But as for the people, their looks, the colour of their eyes, the subtle differences in the shapes of their features, he took no interest. Words are valuable and may equate to further accumulation of wealth, if you notice the telltale nuances of inflection, he would say. But appearances are usually showy and of no true use. "I believe I have seen all that I wish to," replied Arthur, not wanting to enter into anything even remotely in the vicinity of pleasantries. If I may, there is one item I would very much appreciate you looking over." The man's tone was earnest, but there was something else within it, buried below the gentle and melodic features. Arthur failed to place what that something else was, but it intrigued him nevertheless. He allowed the, perhaps stout, gentleman to lead the way, which, with the innumerable quantities of useless personal effects filling up every conceivable nook of the building, took longer than Arthur desired to allot. He did, however, take a small pleasure in watching the man toil, and almost cried out in joyous alacrity when a precarious pile of large, worn boxes toppled and struck the man heavily on the shoulder. Finally, they entered what at one point may have been the dining room. It was too small to be a sitting room, and there was no sign of any other purpose, but Arthur believed he could make out what looked to be a small table under the reams of bills, shopping catalogues, and toppled mountains of coupons. The man pushed through, and there, beside the dust-addled French doors, stood the chair. The man gestured towards it. "I have no time for jokes," scoffed Arthur. "Where is the item that may be of some interest?" This is it," replied the man. The tone appeared to be the same, with only a slight increase of the mysterious aspect, and Arthur was desperately trying to place it. The man must have noticed the quizzical nature of his countenance, for he continued. "It's a very rare type of wood, so I'm told, hence the odd colour. Purplish sheen, you'll notice. Fine, almost imperceivable, but it's there, especially if it catches the sun correctly. It's not a colouring or a varnish neither. It's natural, one of a kind, I should think. Probably worth a lot, just for the wood, but as a chair..." Arthur scoffed loudly again. "That is not a chair. It is barely anything. Who carved it? A blind woodsman?" Well," continued the man, sounding slightly hurt, as though the comment had attacked him personally. "Be that as it may, I believe there is a great value to it, and I'm willing to let you have it as fair as I may offer." Arthur's patience had grown weary. "I will leave it. Good day," he uttered impudently, and with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Wait!" the man called, as Arthur was making some effort to leave the room. The tone was clear this time, and all at once Arthur recognised what the mysterious element had been. He turned back to face the gentleman, and can still remember the momentary look of absolute horror that glimmered from his eyes. It was fear. "You have my attention, although it is both brief and fickle," Arthur cautioned. "With this at the forefront of your mind, explain yourself." "I insist you take it," implored the man, with a voice that flitted between fear and panic. "No," replied Arthur, stoic. "I have no need. It's free. Surely you can make some little amount on it." "No," Arthur insisted once more. "I do not deal in small change. I have asked only for an explanation. If you cannot, or more likely will not furnish me with such, then our business is concluded, sir." I will pay you." "What?" Arthur raised a brow suspiciously at this notion. He had seen fools part with their money easily before, for the wants of their wives or children, for the needs of their addictions, or for their pointless collections. But he had never seen someone so utterly willing to throw away their meagre wealth. I will pay you to take it away," the man repeated with a more stony and serious voice. "You are a fool, and I am tired of you." Arthur turned another time to exit. £500. This made Arthur pause, and he looked back to eye the man, who stood firm and still. Sensing someone who had taken leave of their senses somewhere within their grief, and fearing not for taking full advantage of such, Arthur proposed a counter-offer of 1,000, to which the bereaved swiftly acquiesced. "One stipulation," stated Arthur. "Yes?" asked the man, with a new sound of relief flushing through his utterances. "I will only take it should you explain to me, to my complete satisfaction, why you wish rid of it so greatly. If I am unsatisfied, or if I believe this to be some form of scam, I shall leave that damnable thing where it is." Silence abounded. "Ah, then it is as I assumed," chimed Arthur. "Good day, sir." "No, wait." There was a choke in the man's throat. "It's nothing, really. It's only..." "Only what, man? For goodness sake, spit it out! What is so utterly awful that you would pay a stranger £1,000 to remove it? What has you acting like such a coward and falling over your words? Speak, or I will leave." "Well, it's just superstition," countered the man. "A laughable affliction, not something I suppose that you would believe in." It is true that I am not superstitious, nor am I one to believe the mad ramblings of another. But as I have previously stated, and am pained to have to state again, it is a condition of me taking the accursed item, and on that I will not budge. Now will you tell me the truth of why you wish it gone, or not?" Arthur began to feel an impatient vexation, but the man was subjugated, and his shoulders lowered. "Fine. I will tell you," he said. "But I don't expect you to believe it, nor will you find it satisfactory if you aren't a believer." "Damned if you do. But luckily, my fellow, I am quite apt at telling if someone is lying, and you have been such an appalling liar so far. Even if I don't believe you, I will simply think you mad, and take your stupid chair anyway. Be earnest, and you have nothing to lose." Arthur smiled, smug and victorious. The man sighed and began. "I grew up here as a child. My aunt and uncle took me in. Why has little relevancy, so I won't go into detail. But I remember the place being very different to how you see it right now. I know it looks full to the brim, dingy, tight, messy. The abode of a feeble and broken mind, but it wasn't always like this, not until my uncle died. The house used to be pristine and beautifully kept. My aunt was almost regimental in its cleanliness. Though since my uncle passed, this collecting habit started, and the newspapers and clippings... Well, I suppose what I'm really trying to impress upon you is that this household was normal. My aunt and uncle were normal, salt of the earth, good people. We were a normal family." "What has this got to do with anything?" Arthur cried out, becoming heated and starting to flush. "I do not wish to know how clean and ordinary you are. By your absurd behaviour and by the very state of this house, I have already seen first-hand the type of family you are. Now explain to me why you wish rid of the chair, or kindly stop wasting my time." The man nodded and lowered his head as if in shame. "Okay. I'm sorry. You're right, I suppose. I'll move on, and I'll focus on the chair. I don't know how the chair was brought into the house. My aunt would never say where it came from, only that my uncle was helping an old friend. It wasn't here when I left at 18, and I didn't see it for the first time until I was 21. It arrived at a time that I was becoming a man. Not chronologically, I mean, but the age that we venture out and strive to make a name, or leave a mark, or gather money. The age when visits to the parental home become fewer and further between. I know that generally in a person's late 20s and early 30s there is a renaissance of sorts, a renewed interest in the past and of strengthening family ties. But at that point I was solely focused on building a future and having all the fun that independence affords us. Arthur was grating his teeth so hard that he swore the man could hear it, and cast him a detestable look which alone spoke the words, "Hurry up." "Sorry," continued the man. "The first time I saw the chair I was visiting for Christmas, and as I went in to surprise them, I found my uncle sat upon it, his eyes wild and unblinking. He was having a conversation, but there was no one else in the room. What was odd too was that there was almost a purplish tinge to the air in there, and the closer I moved towards my uncle, the more every other sound in the world seemed to be drowned out by something else. Voices, I think, but also that colour, the thickening purplish haze. Then it was like the room flooded with air, and it was strange. It was as though I hadn't even noticed it had gone, but I was struck by how much I needed to breathe. Like when you surface after spending a minute or two underwater. I heard my uncle take an equally desperate breath, and then for the first time since I had entered, he noticed me. His eyes zeroed in, and they were full of something horrific, a look I had never seen him give before. He screamed at me to get out in a voice that I could swear was not his own, a voice that seemed to claw at my very essence, deep, ancient, and terrible. I left the room and slammed the door. "What is this?" demanded Arthur. "So your uncle had lost his mind and given you a fright? For the last time, man, why do you want rid of this chair?" "I really am sorry." There was a shaky desperation in the man's tone. "But there's no shorter way to tell it, not if I'm going to make my reasoning clear." Arthur sighed and looked down towards his pocket watch, and at length he stated, "Fine. £2,000 will grant you 1 hour of my time. But mark me, sir, if this is wasted, and you do not, at the end of your story, leave me thoroughly satisfied and furnished with the money that through a verbal agreement is now rightfully mine, I can guarantee that some wooden stump will be the very least of your woes." The man agreed to Arthur's conditions and to the new sum of £2,000 before continuing. I found my aunt in the kitchen crying. I asked her how long my uncle had been in there and what had been happening. She would tell me very little, only that my uncle had made a promise to keep the chair and that he wouldn't pass it on. He wouldn't rid himself of it. She told me that the time he spent sat on it had increased lately, and that the state I found him in was becoming more and more unbroken, with only brief periods of lucidity. At that, she instructed me to leave. I refused several times and insisted on staying. I insisted that I should be there to help, but she would not let me, and before I knew it, I was out in the cold, bewildered and hailing a lift back to the city. Afterwards, when I would call, there would be no answer, and if I attempted to drop by, the door was shuttered tight and my aunt would call out for me to take my leave. Over time I grew a little bitter, replacing the supernatural event in my mind with a growing reasoning that they simply did not want me there. They were glad I had finally grown and wanted rid of me. Foolish, I know, but the mind of an adolescent always centres their reasoning around themselves, blaming themselves. I never saw my uncle again. Apparently he grew ever more obsessed with the chair, screaming about gateways beyond imagination and raving about bridges to a permanent hellish limbo. He died sitting in that chair. When I saw my aunt again, when she finally allowed me entrance at his wake, she told me that it was cursed, that she was sorry for having sent me away, and sobbed deeply. "Cursed! Pah!" "So, she was as mad as your uncle had become," Arthur interjected suddenly. He paid no heed to tales of witchcraft and make-believe and wanted no more than to know directly the causal force behind this man's bizarre conduct. He wanted only to know exactly why he would pay so very much to have this item removed. Stung by Arthur's coldness and lack of humanity, the man seized his anger and forced it not to emerge. Instead, he focused on the task of relaying his story. She never really said what the curse was exactly, but in the months that followed his death, she insisted that she repeatedly saw my uncle. She said and was convinced that at times something within that chair was mimicking him, calling out to her to join him and to sit herself on the accursed seat. She stated that often something within herself made her want to acquiesce to the chair's request. But it was the strangeness in my dead uncle's tone and the slightly wrong proportions of his shadow figure, for that is how she described his visitation, that filled her with enough suspicion and dread to pull herself away from the hellish allure of the thing. Other times, though, she said that
she would see my real uncle, and she was convinced that this version was him. The difference was confusion and fear. This shadow creature, for that is how she still described him, seemed dazed, would stumble madly about the place, and then be pulled back towards the chair with flailing outstretched arms. Sometimes this figure would charge at her, trying, as she believed, to force her out of the house and away from the chair. Gradually she became obsessed with the idea that somehow my uncle's soul, from the simple act of dying upon the chair, had fused with it, and that it was now her duty to free him. She went to work collecting, and I saw no harm, in the beginning, in allowing this delusion to work towards a natural end. But it became compulsion, and rendered the house in a state far worse than you see it now. It was soon filled with newspaper articles of the macabre, photographs of strange beings, mysterious objects, and other antiquities. Anything that might help her in her task. She became fixated on books of the occult and was maddened each time a chant or a mantra or a spell would produce no effect. It became intense, wrong, deeply disturbing to see her. It made it difficult to continue visiting. I did not wish to see another family member succumb to madness, and rather than try to help, rather than stay to support, perhaps seek medical intervention, I took the cowardly option and retreated back into my own life. My visits became fewer and fewer. Towards the end of her life, as she withered due to cancer in her brain and lungs, I did begin frequenting the place more often again. And here is where she took an even more obsessive interest in that chair. It resided, buried under years of accumulated hoardings, in the exact place that my uncle had passed. But as she grew closer to her final breath, she kept repeating that the chair was calling to her, that it wouldn't leave her alone, that the chair wanted her soul. And in every conscious moment she could hear a chilling rhythm, a beat made up of words. The words, "Come to me." She kept saying that she had to die in it. She had to go to the thing and be with my uncle. It called to her. It was reaching out, beckoning her with sounds and sweet perfumes. In her final hours, she must have left her bed, which is very strange, because her illness had left her emaciated. She had not been lucid for several days and needed around-the-clock care. She could barely even raise her arms. To think how she could have had the strength to make it down those stairs. God rest and blessed her poor soul. Arthur punctuated this aside's inconsequence by withdrawing his pocket watch again and flicking his eyes from the object to the man. Well, she too, just like my uncle, was found dead in the chair. So that's it. 2 of your relatives coincidentally die in the same chair, and that is why you are willing to pay a stranger £2,000 to take it away. Superstition and death. A tale of other worlds and ghouls from people clearly sick in the mind, and you take leave of your own senses. If you really hate it that much, why not just take it out the back and burn it? Why not just throw it away? Arthur stared in disbelief. You don't think I've tried? The man's eyes suddenly filled with intensity. You don't think I've gotten rid of it already? You don't think I've attempted to burn the thing? To set ablaze the very item that pulls to the forefront of my mind the suffering of those that raised me? It belongs to me now. It won't leave me. It comes back. It is mine. And I can't make you understand without it being yours, but I feel that I belong to it too. It's a damnable feeling. It's as though those iron spikes are slowly piercing through and hooking at my soul. And the only way I think I can rid myself of it is for it to belong to someone else. Or for someone else to belong to it. he began to calm again. No, it's not just that they died in it. That is not the sole reason that I will pay so much to have it gone. He paused, searching for the words. I do not wish to deceive in these matters. I suppose truly, if I didn't tell you everything, then the guilt would eventually outweigh the joy of ridding myself from this wicked thing. Despite himself, Arthur began to take a slight interest in the man's words. Go on then, he said, studying the man closely. I will refrain from interrupting until you are quite finished. The man drew a deep breath. I decided to stay here after my aunt's passing. I know the state of the place is awful, but in truth, I had intended, and still do, to live here. Regardless of my current tale and the terrible subject that it centres around, this was my home for a large portion of my life, and I have warm memories of it prior to all that I have disclosed. I wish to have my own family here, and to raise my children in the place that I have felt most loved. Furthermore, once cleared up, it's quite a decent space. I reasoned that by resting here for several nights, following my aunt's passing, I could get it cleaned up more promptly, and so I stayed. It was a mammoth undertaking, and one that I had underestimated. Years of accumulation aren't so easy to scrub away, and I spent much of my time making imperceivable changes. Slowly, darkness descended on the first evening. Arthur pulled some boxes together, sensing that the story would take some time to complete, and fashioned himself somewhere to sit. The man had proven chatty, much to Arthur's disliking. He preferred people who were like him and to the point. Still, he was now decidedly willing to put up with these ramblings for the high sum he had been offered, if all he had to endure was superstition and a ghost story fabricated by grief. The day had passed quickly, and as I said, due to an extensive volume of paperwork needing to be carefully looked over, I had done far less than I had wished. I had brought with me some food to last for a few days, only scraps that would not need cooking. I don't know if you've seen the kitchen, but everything is still buried, and there really is no way of cooking anything. Not without a lot of time and some great effort. So I ate and chose to get an early night. I had moved most of the boxes and papers away from my old bedroom and into the others along the hallway. This provided me a space on the bed and a small walkway to get to it. This was the first thing I had accomplished, and I was proud to see some slight headway. It meant I could retire whenever I felt the need. It was quiet, and I slept deeply until around 1. Suddenly, and without prelude, there was a single definite scream. I sat bolt upright, heart immediately drumming, my eyes searching the darkness for any indication of something amiss. After the initial fright began to subside, I rationalized that it may have been no more than a waking dream. But as I sat there, eyes still staring into the gloom and gradually becoming as awake as you or I are now, it called out again. Strange though, it seemed like a wail more than a scream. Something sad, something to be pitied, but powerfully loud. Cynicism wrote itself in the corners of Arthur's mouth as the man proceeded. I must admit, I hesitated to do anything at all at first, but a third and much more horrific scream, as if someone were being tortured to the brink of their resolution, brought me to my feet. I don't know why or what exactly I would do, should I find the source of the distress, but I moved over quickly, by instinct, to turn on the lights. As I moved the switch up, nothing happened, and try as I might, no amount of repeated flicking could get them to work. So I stood there in the darkness with a thumping heart, and I started attempting to hold my breath, or to at least slow it. I don't know if you've ever heard your own breathing in a situation that requires you to be deathly silent, but it suddenly becomes as loud and as boisterous as a brass band, so slowing it made me feel slightly more at ease. It took so long for the next scream to occur that I had already begun to reassure myself that its cause had been resolved. I tried to force myself to believe it had been no more than a trick of the tired mind. Yet I continued breathing slowly, and was as silent as one could possibly be. As it called once more, echoing and reverberating into all accessible space. The door which I stood beside began to pound and vibrate vigorously. At the same time, the air grew dense and harder to pull into my lungs. There was a chill to it, noticeably cooler than it had been before, but caused by no draught. The trembling of the door quickly transformed to a pounding that rose into a haunting crescendo, and I felt the hammering of my heart thrashing in time with that horrific rhythm. It was a regular and forceful beat that seemed to contain the power to rip the door from its very hinges. I pressed against it with all the strength I had, and as I did, I felt a stabbing cold from it pass into my own skin, which pricked, almost as though an ethereal finger were drawing itself along my flesh. The pity that I had attributed to the sound of the scream had now vanished, and instead I realized there was something malignant here, something that wanted to smash through the door that my wearing body was forbidding. It didn't feel human. As the struggle continued, the air took on a strange quality, perfumed and dotted with transparent pulses of delicate purples. Then there came not a whisper, but more like the thought of a whisper. It said, "Let me in." All at once, and in the instant that I was to admit defeat, the rattling suddenly ceased. The closing air dispersed, and the house fell into an uneasy silence. All of reality came back into being, and I collapsed down to the floor. I should have left at that point.
"Nonsense!" spat Arthur. "Utter and complete drivel. You mean for me to accept that all this occurred, and your first action was not to leave the house? I don't believe it for a moment. Any rational mind, not that anyone who would experience such a thing could be described as rational, but any human being equipped with the most basic survival instincts would turn and leave the place immediately at the merest suggestion of the supernatural."
"I understand your skepticism," returned the man. "But really, why would I lie to you? You are a stranger to me, invited only through reputation, who I am to pay £2,000 based on superstition. Why would I make up anything? There's a chance I am mad, but if I am just a madman, are you not compensated anyway?" Arthur had no answer to this, and instead showed relent in the waving of his hand. The man looked out of the coloured glass panes of the French doors and continued. "I did not leave because in that very moment equilibrium reigned, and all seemed correct. I felt no real danger from this house because it was my home, my family home anyway, and that is after all our truest home. I had lived in it for many years before, and there were no signs of malevolence prior to the events I have thus far mentioned. The souls that reside here are those of my family, who I have never wronged and love so dearly. There was something else, too, that swayed me, an almost surreal swelling of euphoria and nostalgia that told me, perhaps against my better judgment, to remain. Looking back on it now, I wonder if this sudden feeling of contentment were not the chair itself, claiming my being and doing so by making me resigned to or even joyous about my fate. Regardless of this sudden, unexplained bliss, I took precautions and made a thorough survey of the house, as well as checking every point of access. I can assure you I found the place quite empty and completely undisturbed. Only then did I return to bed. Despite the events, I even managed a few more hours of restful sleep, and awoke the next day, sprightly and refreshed. The sleep had served to place a barrier between the events of the night before, and their reality started to become questionable. More than that, it was like they hadn't even happened, as though something at the time began to block out my memory of it. But he turned back to face Arthur at this point, and there was a burning vehemence about the man. It was a visage and fervour that struck Arthur due to its sudden intensity. "I wish to God that I had left that night." Though not believing, Arthur felt a small pinprick of fear creep across his being. It made him feel a mixture of disgust and anger that he should let himself be affected in such a manner by nothing more than ramblings. The day passed in a haze, and so fast that I barely completed any more than had been achieved the previous day. I retired to bed early again, suffering from a lethargy that seemed to be brought on by the approaching evening. I could not tell you the time that the first scream rang out, but the events that followed mirrored those from the night before exactly. This time, however, my body gave way against the trembling of the door, and I was unable to stop it from flying open.
"I've had enough of this!"
Arthur stood. He had lost some colour and was gritting his teeth tightly. He was becoming more affected by the story than he cared to.
"Keep your stories and keep your accursed damn stool!"
£3,000. The man, now oddly calm, stated almost matter-of-factly. Arthur met the man's firm gaze and held it, looking for a sign of fallacy in its stare that may have suggested an untruth, hence permitting him an opportunity to leave. He could see only belief and conviction, and was wordless as he returned to his seated position on the boxes. There was nothing of mass out in the dark, foreboding hallway, the man continued, but there was a sense of something otherworldly and angry that wanted its presence to be known. Then, with the door wide, the tumultuous scream bounded in, but I had been wrong. Now I could hear it clearly. I could tell that it was not a scream at all, but howling, strained laughter. It was hypnotic, mesmerizing, and it seized my body, grasping me with invisible hands, pulling at my limbs, drawing me forward. I fought with all my will, and though every thought was still my own, my body would not yield to my direction. The thrall of that terrible laugh pulled me down the stairs, each cackle lifting my legs before forcing them back down and leading towards the room in which we now stand. Then I saw the chair. At this, the man who had been so strong until this point broke. Tears cascaded down his cheeks, and his clenched hands visibly shook. There was a gathering of darkness sat upon it. It took the form of my aunt. But I would swear before God, before Lucifer, before any man, demon or angel, that it was not her. It was something mimicking her lines, but composed of pure hatred. It oozed from the presence in waves that physically struck out. The room was bathed in a dark purple hue, and the eyes of the thing, oh, holy Lord, the eyes! They were pulsing red balls of flames that wanted more than anything else to burn the flesh from my bones and feast with a tearing ferocity on my soul. It did not speak, but I knew exactly what it said. Join me. It was there in those demonic, hateful eyes. Join me. The laughter rose once more, and with it swelled a dizziness that disorientated, and a thick haze that began to hide the extreme horrors of that scene. It went dark after that, and there was nothing for a little while, until I came to on the floor. But I hadn't awoken from a nightmare. I wasn't greeted by morning and the prior haunting euphoria. I was still in this horror, and could only feel fear. True, real, desperately painful fear. I tilted my vision so that I could take in the beast stretching itself from the chair, and my stomach dropped as I realized it was almost upon me. I leaped up, barreled through the front door, and exited with haste into the night. Every time I checked behind, I imagined seeing those eyes. Those terrible eyes. I see them still. Every night. Every time I lay down to rest, and I awaken to the sound of that sickening laughter. It will not cease. and no matter the distance I place between myself and that God-forsaken chair, I hear it still. Because, you see, as I have said, it belongs to me, and I belong to it." The man was quite drained from his tale, and almost sat directly on the chair. At realizing what he was about to do, a flicker of horror came into his features, and he shifted his weight, which made him fall face first into the wall. Arthur remained silent, ignoring this, and considered matters for some time. Finally he stood. "I will take your chair. I do not believe a word you have said, but it seems that the transaction is beneficial to both of us. I will gain £4,000, adjusted for having to endure the idiocy of your story, and you will gain peace of mind, though I do suggest you see a doctor and take plenty of air." The man walked over to Arthur and took his hand as if to shake, but instead he grasped it and pulled Arthur towards him so that his mouth met Arthur's ear. "There is only one of us that will benefit from this transaction. You can believe me on that." And as he moved away, he gave Arthur a deep, solemn look. There was a thud. A door closed downstairs. It called Arthur from his memories of acquiring the chair and back into the present, back into the attic. He had lived alone for most of his life and liked the solitude. He held no affection for his fellow man and was some miles away from any neighbour. Therefore, the thud could only be one of two things. Some item, any heavy item within his house, that had somehow and quite mysteriously fallen. Or someone had forced entry. At the thought of the latter, which was confirmed quickly via sounds of movement and a complete lack of subtlety, his spirit became alight with a raw fury. He heard the rattling of pots and pans and placed the intruder in the kitchen. The nearest police station was perhaps 30 miles away, and calling for help would be redundant. This was a time for action, he reasoned. This was his house, and he felt no trace of concern for his safety. He only wanted whoever it was out. In fact, that was his only thought, to drive them out, to get them away, to make sure they didn't stay here, couldn't stay here. The thought overtook him, flashed over and over in his mind, and he wasn't quite sure why. Forcefully, he marched down the attic staircase and strode powerfully into his bedroom. He noted that same lack of care and attention to cleaning that he had seen in the attic, and decided right in that moment that the maid was to be fired. Pulling out a small drawer of his bedside table, he reached in behind and withdrew a hidden kitchen knife. He also took a heavy clock from his dresser. Without hesitation, he flew down the staircase and threw open the kitchen door. What he saw inside took his mind back to the man with the chair. They were not human. Instead, he saw formless black masses, gatherings of darkness that froze upon his entering. Shadow creatures. That's how the aunt had described them, and that's what he now saw. Shadow creatures invading his kitchen. "An affront to nature! An affront to my eyes!" he called as he launched the heavy, ornate clock at one of the forms. But as he did, something troubled him. The forms did not seem ready to fight, or to scare, or to drag Arthur into some ghastly netherworld. They did, in fact, give the impression of alarm at his presence, and by him entering the kitchen. They appeared afraid. They gathered in one corner, making imperceivable sounds, but certainly ones that indicated a severe fright. He couldn't understand why they were the ones who feared him. but he was still overwhelmed by the feeling that he had to send them away. He had to drive them out. He had to... What? He thought. To protect them? No, to protect me, of course. He summoned an almost demonic voice and called out to the beings, "Out! Out of my sight! Out of my house! And out of my mind! Forever!" Following his command, the kitchen door flew open, and the shapes hastily retreated, disappearing into the thickening night. He charged towards the open door and slammed it shut, locking the deadbolt as he did. Then, looking around the kitchen, he was suddenly stricken by a dim, seizing anxiety in the guise of nausea. He recognized the room well, but the curtains, the equipment, the flooring, none of it was his own. Everything that was his had been replaced. It was as though, in the short time he had slept in the attic, someone had completely remodeled his entire kitchen. Then, a rhythm began, so faintly at first that he could scarcely detect it. But its presence was all too real. The irregular rhythm was accompanied by a melody, beautiful but horrifying. Arthur's eyes began to widen and bulge as his body suddenly felt much less his own. He was becoming wooden and rigid until he found himself without the ability to move at all. The melody began to swell and danced with a whistling wind that emanated powerfully from the nothingness outside. As the rhythm increased and the power of the melody coursed through him, Arthur felt his own body begin to move through no volition of his own. He left the kitchen, climbed the first flight of stairs, and stood before the entranceway to the attic. His mind began to scream, trapped behind his prison of immobility, and every part of him that was still his scrambled and prayed and begged to refrain from mounting that final stairway. He had forgotten something. He knew that now, and the thought made the nausea worsen. It was important. Something had happened. He needed more time to figure it out, but more than anything else, he needed to be away from that attic. It was useless, though. The melody was in full swing, and the invisible force which had him petrified carried on marching to the haunting beat. His legs moved his body up the staircase. He remembered the fear in the man's voice, the mysterious fear in the owner of the chair, and he wanted to scream out that he was sorry. He was sorry for disbelieving. He was sorry for treating the man with contempt and scorn. He wished to go back and change his decision, to leave the chair, to leave it in the God-forsaken hoarder's house. But it was too late, and it had been from the very moment he had taken it. At the top of the staircase, Arthur's body forced itself towards the attic window, and in a last act of defiance, he managed to pull the lids of his eyes down, sparing himself from the view for just a moment longer. They too eventually relented, and his sight was cast out over a world that he didn't recognize. Throbbing, pendulous multitudes of purple clouds amassed outside the now liquid panes of glass, and in it swirled torn apparitions crying out for relief from the pain, each one pierced by iron hooks and fused to small circular pieces of wood. Thousands of ripped and bloodied faces of ghouls whipped by in a cyclone of terror as the music grew louder to deafening proportions. He wanted to cry for them, to show he was capable of human emotion, to show he was capable of pity, of redemption. Then he saw his own reflection in the rippling glass, and he understood. The missing piece of memory forced its way back to him. Deliberately, his vision was guided back around the room, and there was a beckoning, a low hum, a laugh. The chair glowed magnificently in its purple sheens and called out to Arthur's being. The metal spikes, shaped like fangs, were waiting, hungry, wanting to pierce him and to hook him and to fuse him to the seat forever. Join me, it spoke, wordless. Join all of us. Arthur felt the tingling, numb sensation returning to his hands as his body contorted and bent. Dust filled his eyes and his veins ran dry. Still, his mind screamed, "Not there! Anywhere but there! Lord, have mercy on this soul! Please, do not sit me in that accursed chair!" The continuing melody blended with the irregular rhythm and the laughter. The purple clouds melted and became lyrics as the screaming, swirling cyclone choir melded, combining into a singular agony. And somewhere, deep within it all, Arthur's mind remained intact, understanding and knowing for eternity. The pain never ending, the images forever revolving, and the deep hues of purple always pulsing, never quietening. The chair belonged to Arthur, and Arthur, for very many years now, belonged to the chair. Thank you very much for joining me here at the Horror Story Corner, and thank you so much again to everybody who's commented, liked, tickled that little bell icon, subscribed, and done anything to support this channel. I really, really do. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this original tale. If you did, be sure to check out my other original story, At Night It Screams. And until next time, pleasant dreams. What's that? Still here? After all 4 of the terrifying tales? They didn't make you run away in fear? Well, why not subscribe then for new originals and classic audios coming soon. Thank you for listening, and, as ever, sleep well.